Just outside the front window of the spacecraft, suspended in the black, hung the jewel-like blue-green marble of the Earth. The view was beautiful, amazing, awe-inspiring. But Mission Commander Neil Armstrong didn't have the time to enjoy the view. He was sharply focused on landing the Apollo 11 lunar module, the Eagle, on the Moon. There were no second chances. They'd either land, crash, or abort the lunar landing. The Eagle was only 30,000 feet and rapidly descending toward the surface of the Moon when suddenly a master alarm rang and the onboard navigational computer flashed error code 1202. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 launched from Cape Kennedy, Florida, carrying 3 astronauts: Commander Neil Armstrong, Commander Module Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin on a mission to the Moon. Once Apollo 11 reached the Moon and entered lunar orbit, the lunar module, named the Eagle, undocked from the command and service modules, which formed the Columbia. The spacecraft then made a carefully controlled descent to land on the Moon. After the Eagle touched down at 2017 UTC on July 20, 1969, 650 million people worldwide watched their TVs in awe as Commander Armstrong took humanity's first step on the Moon. The moon landing has become the stuff of legend, immortalized in photographs and movies. To many, it seemed like the trip to the moon was an amazing success, carried out by brave astronauts with ease. However, behind the scenes, Mission Control in Houston and the astronaut crew had to troubleshoot various hazards in real time throughout the historic mission. Here are 7 different ways the astronauts of the Apollo 11 mission almost didn't make it home. Number 1. Imagine being crammed into a tiny spacecraft with only 160 cubic feet of livable space, 7.5 minutes from the surface of the moon, and your navigational computer throws up an unknown error code. That's exactly what happened. Armstrong was preparing to land the Eagle on the moon when the Apollo guidance computer, the AGC, suddenly displayed error code 1202. The AGC was a technological marvel for its time. It was fairly compact, weighing only 70.1 pounds and requiring 70 watts at 28 volts DC. The computer was central to the mission, especially landing. Among other tasks, it managed navigation, velocity, altitude, and engine performance data. It also constantly adjusted the abort trajectory, prepared to shoot the crew back into orbit should something force an abort. Neither Armstrong nor his co-astronaut Aldrin knew what error code 1202 was. He had never even seen it during the many simulated moon landings he had done during training. Armstrong alerted Houston and they told him to ignore the error code and proceed with the mission. The computer system ended up triggering error code 1202 a nerve-wracking 4 times and 1201 once. As it turns out, the computer was being overloaded with too many commands from a radar system and was running out of memory. Number 2. Around the same time that the navigational computer was flashing overload error codes, the astronauts had another serious problem on their hands. About 9 minutes before the Eagle was set to touch down on the surface of the moon, Armstrong realized that they were going to overshoot their carefully chosen landing site. He estimated they'd miss by approximately 3 miles, which was a good guess. They actually missed it by 4. When the Eagle undocked from the Columbia, unvented residual pressure inside the tunnel that connected the 2 spacecrafts gave the Eagle an additional boost as it separated. Though slight, the extra push put the Eagle out of range of the desired landing site. The moon is covered with craters and rocks, and the planned landing site was relatively smooth. Worse yet, the lunar module was burning fuel quicker than expected. Soon, Houston alerted the Eagle that they only had 60 seconds of fuel left before they'd have to abort the mission. The spacecraft careened, skimming over the lunar terrain at 34 miles per hour. The descent engine kicked up dust from the surface, making it hard to see. With less than 30 seconds of fuel left in the tank, Armstrong landed the Eagle into a fairly smooth-looking area. The blue contact light on the console came on. Then Armstrong said the phrase that's now been committed to history: "Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." Number 3. Not long after the Eagle landed on the moon, another problem began to develop. Though the landing engine fuel line had been shut down, sensors were detecting a pressure buildup. This meant that ice had plugged the descent fuel helium heat exchanger, and there was some fuel vapor caught in the line between the exchanger and the valves. The vapor was being heated by the Eagle's hot engine, building pressure which could cause an explosion. NASA rapidly drew up plans to vent the system. However, before Houston could relay instructions to Armstrong and Aldrin, the ice plug thawed and the gas dispersed on its own, remedying the problem. Number 4. Another hazard that could have prevented the astronauts from successfully completing their mission to the moon and returning home was simply an unknown. NASA didn't know how stable the surface of the moon was. The Eagle being able to land firmly on Tranquility Bay was a good sign. However, did a thin layer of moon dust cover jagged shards of rock that could cause an injury to the lander or astronauts? Although the Surveyor landers and other previous robotic missions had studied the lunar surface, it wasn't until Armstrong's iconic footstep onto the gray moon dust that NASA was sure the surface would support EVA, or extravehicular activity. As it turns out, lunar dust is dangerous, mainly due to its abrasiveness. Lunar dust has been created over billions of years by meteorite impacts. However, the moon lacks processes that would grind down these tiny particles into smoother shapes. Astronauts from various missions report tiny shards of rock permeating lunar module interiors, jamming zippers, and even penetrating layers of protective spacesuit material. Lunar dust travels ballistically because there's no atmosphere on the moon, and it will stick to anything. Number 5. A broken switch almost trapped the astronauts on the moon. No one knows exactly how the switch broke, but Aldrin is fairly certain that it happened after he and Armstrong re-entered the Eagle following their 2.5-hour walk on the moon. The flight plan instructed the astronauts to seal the lunar module's hatch, repressurize the cabin, disconnect their backpacks, and connect their spacesuit hoses to the spacecraft's life support systems. After that, they would vent the cabin once more, open up the hatch, and throw the backpacks and other unneeded equipment onto the moon's surface, thereby reducing the weight of the craft for liftoff. Though Armstrong and Aldrin had practiced the routine many times during training, somehow, during execution, one of them banged something or stumbled against Aldrin's side of the instrument panel, snapping off a small switch. Settling on the floor to rest, Aldrin happened to notice a little black switch lying in the lunar dust which had permeated the cabin. To their dismay, the astronauts realized that the broken piece was a small circuit breaker arm that controlled the power running to the ascent engine. If it was broken off, it couldn't be pressed in on the console to complete the circuit. The ascent engine wouldn't be able to power up, and the Eagle couldn't blast off the moon. The astronauts alerted Houston to the problem. While the astronauts tried to nap, NASA engineers scrambled to find a workaround that would reroute power to the engine without the switch. Unfortunately, after several hours, they still hadn't found a solution. The broken end of the switch was still visible deep inside its small hole on the console. Sadly, it was too small of a hole for a finger. However, Aldrin was able to use a felt-tipped pen to depress the circuit breaker and close the circuit, allowing the ascent engine to power back up. Basically, Aldrin pulled a MacGyver move to help get the Eagle back into the Columbia. Number 6. The command module carrying the astronauts back to Earth was almost hit by burning, disintegrating chunks of the surface module during re-entry to the Earth's atmosphere. To return to Earth, the flight plan was that the Columbia would separate into two parts. The astronauts would stay inside the command module, while the service module was jettisoned. Once safely away, the command module would position itself so the heat shield was facing towards Earth's atmosphere. As the command module descended to the lower atmosphere, the parachute would deploy, slowing the spacecraft and leading to a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean approximately 5 minutes later. Meanwhile, the service module would break apart and burn up while entering Earth's atmosphere. To prevent any debris from the service module accidentally colliding with the command module and injuring or even killing the astronauts, the service module was supposed to perform a series of thrust maneuvers to move it away from the re-entry path of the command module. In fact, by shifting the service module to a significantly different trajectory, its orbit would change and it wouldn't even re-enter the Earth's atmosphere at the same time as the command module. However, the thrust maneuvers of the service module failed, and both modules from the Apollo 11 mission followed the same re-entry trajectory. Luckily, no debris from the disintegrating service module hit the command module, and the astronauts were able to splash down safely. Later, it was realized that there was an error in how the service module was configured to jettison its remaining fuel. Number 7. A final issue that may have prevented the astronauts returning home was the possibility of alien infections. In 1969, only a few robotic landers had been to the moon. Their studies confirmed that the moon's surface was rocky, dusty, covered in craters, and devoid of complex life forms. However, NASA still took precautions in case the astronauts were possibly exposed to and infected by alien microbes. After the command module successfully splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24, 1969, the USS Hornet recovered astronauts Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. They were immediately placed in a mobile quarantine facility and transported to the NASA Lunar Receiving Laboratory at the Johnson Space Center. There, the astronauts were moved to a larger quarantine facility. After determining that the astronauts hadn't been infected by any nasty space germs, they were released on August 10, 1969, just shy of 3 weeks after they had returned to Earth. In 1996, some 30 years after the Apollo 11 mission, a draft of the speech President Richard Nixon would have given to the nation in the event of a mission failure was released. Considering all the issues that went wrong and all the issues that could have gone wrong during Apollo 11, it's amazing that the mission was successful and the astronauts made it home. To quote the beautiful yet poignant speech that President Nixon never had to give, "In ancient days, men looked at the stars and saw their heroes in the constellations. In modern times, we do much the same, but our heroes are epic men of flesh and blood. Others will follow and surely find their way home. Man's search will not be denied. But these men were first, and they will remain the foremost in our hearts." Usually, waking up because you have to go to the bathroom is annoying, but on May 26, 2013, waking up and leaving his bunk to use the bathroom was a decision that saved 29-year-old Harrison Ojegba Okene's life. Through an odd twist of fate, Harrison ended up being the lone survivor of a boat sinking at sea. He can lay claim to a unique title. He's the only person in the world to have survived on the seafloor for nearly 3 days. The Gulf of Guinea in the southeast Atlantic Ocean is rich with petroleum-laden layers of sedimentary seabed. Many offshore oil rig drilling operations dot the African coast here. On May 26th, about 20 miles off of Escravos, Nigeria, in choppy seas, 3 tugboats pitched and yawed as they performed tension tow functions on a Chevron oil tanker filling up at single buoy mooring number 3. Just before 5 a.m., the tugboat Jascon 4 was caught by a large rogue wave and capsized. Because of ongoing piracy problems in the Gulf, security protocol on the tugboat was that the 12-man crew would lock themselves in their room when sleeping. Unfortunately, this rule slowed down the Jascon 4's crew when they tried to escape. The crew members had to first scramble out of their cabins, that is, except for the vessel's cook, Harrison, who had gotten up to use the bathroom in his underwear. When the tugboat keeled over and the ocean rushed in, Harrison had to force the bathroom's metal door open against the wall of water. The pressure of the water was extremely strong and Harrison was unable to follow some of his colleagues to the emergency hatch. He watched in horror as a surge overwhelmed 3 crew members and swept them out of the boat into the raging sea. Then the water pushed Harrison down a narrow hallway into another bathroom which adjoined an officer's cabin. Dazed and bruised but miraculously still alive, Harrison held on to an overturned wash basin to keep his head above water in the 4-foot square bathroom. The boat sank nearly 100 feet, eventually coming to rest upside down on the seabed. When the tugboat capsized, there was an immediate rescue operation launched with the other boats in the area and a helicopter. A diving crew quickly located the wreck and marked the location with buoys. They banged on the hull. Harrison hammered back, but they didn't hear him. As the divers weren't prepared for deep diving, they could only stay at the depth of the wreck for a limited period of time. The rescue was called off due to no evidence of survivors. After nearly a day of being in the bathroom, Harrison got up the courage to leave his little air pocket. In pitch darkness, he swam and felt his way into the engineer's office. Miraculously, there was another air pocket here too, of about 4 feet high in Harrison's estimation. Having solved the immediate problem of having air to breathe, Harrison could focus on other concerns. The first one being that he was cold. In May, the surface temperature of the East Atlantic on average is a pleasant 81.9 degrees Fahrenheit, but Harrison was 100 feet down. Shivering, wet, and wearing only boxer shorts, Harrison faced hypothermia, or his body losing heat faster than he could produce it. Cautiously, Harrison felt his way around the cabin. He found some tools and used them to strip off wall paneling. With a mattress and the material from the wall, he was able to make a platform to sit on. This platform helped Harrison to stay afloat and lifted the upper half of his body out of the water, allowing him to reduce heat loss. Hungry, thirsty, cold, and stuck in complete darkness, Harrison was terrified. He tried to think about his family. Quite religious, whenever he felt especially scared, Harrison would pray and call on Jesus to rescue him. Over time, the seawater began to remove the skin from Harrison's tongue. He could smell something rotting. He thought it was the decomposing bodies of his former shipmates. Every small sound in the dark was magnified. The creaking of the hull, the banging of the wreckage against the walls, and most horrifically, splashing and eating noises as fishes nibbled at corpses. Meanwhile, a dive support vessel, the Luek Toucan, arrived to the area of the sinking. The parent company of the Jascon 4, West African Ventures, had hired a deep-sea salvage saturation diving team from subsea services company DCN Global to retrieve the bodies of the lost crew members. The 6 divers, deck crew, and technical staff of the Luek Toucan knew it was going to be a grueling mission. Aside from the heartrending work of recovering the dead, the boat had sunk upside down into soft mud, stirring up fine silt and creating extremely poor visibility. Furthermore, because of the security protocols, the boat was latched from the inside. Dive Team 2 consisted of Nico van Heerden, Andre Erasmus, and Daryl Oosthuizen, with Supervisor Colby Ware topside on the ship, helping to guide the divers via a connected microphone while watching the dive through a camera worn by Nico. The team spent over an hour breaking through an external watertight door and then a second metal door to get into the sunken boat. Once inside, it was extremely disorienting, with the ceiling being on the bottom and the floor overhead. The murky water was filled with all sorts of hazards, including furniture and equipment. Slowly, painstakingly, the divers explored the boat. They'd recovered 4 corpses when Nico crawled up the stairs to the main deck. It was a tight squeeze with the diving gear on his back. He was in a small passageway getting his bearings when something suddenly reached out of the murk and touched him. Harrison had nearly given up hope when he had heard a noise that sounded like an anchor dropping. Then eventually he heard hammering on the hull of the boat. He knew it had to be divers. He banged on the wall but didn't think they heard him. Then Harrison saw the light from one of the divers' head torches as he swam through the hallway past the far end of the cabin. Unfortunately, the diver was too quick and left the area before Harrison could reach him. But then came the magical moment. You may have seen the surreal, amazing rescue footage from Nico's video when he sees what he believes is another dead body. He touches the corpse's hand, and the hand unexpectedly squeezes his. Nico has a momentary freak out as his supervisor Colby shouts through the microphone, "He's alive! He's alive!" Colby then tells Nico to comfort Harrison by patting him on the shoulder and giving him a thumbs up sign. The divers were amazed to find Harrison alive. The maximum depth for recreational diving is 130 feet. Generally, recreational divers don't stay at 100 feet for more than 20 minutes. In terms of the air pocket, the divers had reached Harrison just in time. A human inhales roughly 350 cubic feet of air every 24 hours. However, because the boat was under pressure on the ocean floor, scientists estimate that Harrison's air pocket had been compressed by a factor of about 4. If the pressurized air pocket were about 216 cubic feet, it would contain enough oxygen to keep Harrison alive for about 2.5 days. When Harrison was located, he had been underwater for about 60 hours. An additional danger came from the carbon monoxide or CO2 buildup. CO2 is fatal to humans at a concentration of about 5%. As Harrison breathed, he exhaled carbon dioxide, slowly increasing the levels of the gas in the tiny space. However, CO2 is absorbed by water, and by splashing the water inside his air pocket, Harrison inadvertently increased the water's surface area, thereby heightening the absorption of CO2 and helping to keep the gas below the lethal 5% level. The divers describe Harrison as having CO2 poisoning, being short of breath and delirious when they found him. He wouldn't have lasted much longer. The divers first used hot water to warm Harrison up, then fitted him with an oxygen mask. Meanwhile, on the surface, the dive support crew was in contact with medical and diving experts, discussing how to best help the survivor. Harrison had a new problem, what divers commonly call the bends. The bends, also known as decompression sickness or caisson disease, occurs when nitrogen bubbles form in the blood as a result of changes in pressure. If Harrison ascended directly from 100 feet underwater to the surface of the ocean, the bubbles in his blood would cause, in the best case, joint pain and rashes, to the worst case, paralysis, neurological issues, cardiac arrest, or possibly even death. It was decided that Harrison would be treated as if he were one of the saturation divers coming up after a dive. Harrison spent about 20 minutes getting used to breathing through the mask. Then the divers put a diving helmet and harness onto him. They were a little worried that he would panic as they got him out of the boat and would be a danger to the dive, but Harrison continued to be cool under pressure. The team was impressed with his level demeanor. Harrison was taken from the boat and led to a diving bell, which took him to the surface. He finally arrived topside at around 7 p.m. on Tuesday, the 28th of May. Disoriented, Harrison thought that it was Sunday evening and that he had only been trapped for 12 hours. He was shocked to learn that he'd been underwater for over 2 days. From the diving bell, Harrison was moved to a decompression chamber where he stayed for another 2.5 days while his body decompressed to surface pressure. Of the 12 crew members on board the tugboat Jascon 4, divers rescued 1 survivor and recovered 10 of the bodies. The search for the 11th crew member had to be called off due to dangerous conditions. Harrison made a full recovery from his ordeal and returned to his hometown of Warri, Nigeria. He didn't go to the funerals of his colleagues because he feared their families' reactions. Nigerians can be very religious, but are also superstitious. Some rumors spread that Harrison saved himself through black magic. Harrison was also plagued with survivor's guilt, wondering why he was the only one to live. Since the incident, Harrison's experienced PTSD. His wife, Akpavono Kene, says he suffers nightmares. Harrison will suddenly awake, screaming and flailing, convinced that he's underwater. Harrison has since taken a cooking job on dry land and vows to never again take a position on a boat. He made a pact with God when he was at the bottom of the ocean. "When I was under the water, I told God, if you rescue me, I will never go back to the sea again. Never." April 27, 2003. An exhausted and pale young man stares into a camcorder. It's 3:05 on Saturday. This marks my 24-hour mark of being stuck in Blue John Canyon. My name is Aaron Ralston. My parents are Donna and Larry Ralston of Englewood, Colorado. Whoever finds this, please make an attempt to get this to them. Be sure of it. I would appreciate it. With his left hand, Ralston moves the camera and records his right arm. At the wrist, it's stuck in a narrow gap between a large boulder and the canyon wall. Past the pinch point, the flesh of his right hand has turned a sickening bluish-gray hue. Ralston explains to the camera that his hand has been without circulation for 24 hours and that he's probably going to die here, all alone, trapped in a remote canyon. But he didn't die. This is the story of how Aaron Ralston self-amputated his arm to save his life. Saturday, April 26, 2003. 27-year-old Aaron Ralston, an avid outdoorsman who excelled at skiing, hiking, and mountain climbing, was supposed to go on a mountaineering trip with his friends, but the plans fell through. He decided to take the trip by himself, and he packed some supplies and his mountain bike in the back of his truck and drove nearly 5 hours to the wilds of southeastern Wayne County, Utah, 2.5 hours away from the nearest tiny town of Moab. Ralston parked his car at the trailhead to Horseshoe Canyon in Canyonlands National Park. Horseshoe Canyon is stunning. It's full of vast rock formations, sandstone monoliths, and deep ravines. It's remote, blue sky, big country where you can hike all day and never see another soul. It was a lovely late spring morning. Ralston's plan was to do a 30-mile loop of biking and canyoneering through Horseshoe and Blue John Canyons. He was dressed in biker shorts with regular shorts on top and a t-shirt. He carried a 25-pound pack filled mainly with climbing gear. He also had a small first aid kit, a cheap knockoff multi-purpose tool, 2 burritos, and a gallon of water split between a hydration pack and a water bottle. Ralston spent the morning mountain biking cross-country. Around midday at the end of his 15-mile ride, he locked his bike to a tree at the top of Blue John Canyon, planning to later drive his truck up to retrieve it. Ralston ran into 2 young female hikers and hiked with them a bit before splitting off to take a tougher part of the canyon. Ralston used his rock climbing equipment to navigate the intricate, narrow passages of Blue John Canyon. After about an hour or so, he came across 3 large boulders wedged in a 3-foot-wide slot canyon that he had to climb over. The second boulder shifted as he tried to scramble over it, painfully crushing his left hand and then pinning his right wrist against the wall. Ralston was stuck. He yanked at his right arm and tried to pull it free. His hand had almost instantly gone numb, but yanking was incredibly painful, and the boulder, later estimated to be 800 pounds, didn't budge. Ralston maneuvered himself as best he could into a more comfortable position. He braced his legs and thrust, trying to push up the boulder with his feet. That didn't work either. Ralston's hands had lost feeling. He was experiencing compartment syndrome. This is when acute pressure is on or builds within a muscle to dangerous levels. Blood flow is decreased, which prevents nourishment and oxygen from reaching the nerves and muscle cells. The compartmentalized tissue rapidly deteriorates and begins to die. Ralston stopped for a break and awkwardly contorted himself to reach the water bottle in his pack. He chugged quite a bit of water before logical thought kicked in. He was stuck. He needed to ration his water supply. He knew the average survival time in a desert without water is between 2 and 3 days, sometimes less if the person is exerting themselves in 100-degree heat. He estimated that he had until Monday night. Ralston forced himself to relax and stop the adrenaline coursing through his body. He then took an inventory of his supplies. In addition to the food and water he had not already eaten, he had a personal CD player with extra CDs, extra AA batteries, a mini digital video camcorder, a digital camera, a 3 LED headlamp, climbing gear, and the multi-tool. His legs were tired of standing, so Ralston used his rope bag to pad the ledge in front of him so he could lean against it. He tried to chip away at the rock with the 3-inch blade on his multi-tool but made no progress. The rock was hard and the blade dull. Ralston spent the next couple hours coming up with and discarding ideas for freeing himself. Early on, he thought about cutting his arm off, but quickly shied away from that notion. As day turned into night, it grew chilly. The temperature dropped to a breezy 30 degrees. Periodically, Ralston turned on his headlamp and continued to try to chip away at the rock to stay warm. He grew exhausted, but when his knees buckled, the weight of his body tugged on his trapped arm, which sent pain shooting through his system. Finally, Ralston constructed a seat. He maneuvered himself into his climbing harness and after many tries managed to throw a carabiner bundle into an overhead crack in the rock and wedge it tight so it could support his weight. For the first time in several hours, Ralston was able to sit. However, after about 15 minutes, the harness restricted blood flow to his legs, so he began sitting and standing in 20-minute intervals to rest his legs but not damage them. Over the next 2 days, Ralston continued to chip at the rock and also tried to construct a pulley system to move the boulder off his hand. It was to no avail. He began urinating into his empty hydration pack, saving his pee. Ralston experienced a host of emotions. He reminisced about happy times with family and friends. He brooded and struggled with remorse and depression over times that had gone poorly. Though not particularly religious, he prayed and spoke aloud to God, asking for help and a way out. A few times he thought he heard voices and yelled for help, but only received the mocking sound of his own voice echoing from rock formations in reply. On Tuesday, when Ralston ran out of water, he began drinking his pee. As time passed, Ralston experimented with cutting his trapped right arm. He stabbed down to the bone, but realized that there was no way his blunt knife would be able to cut through it. Ralston despaired, but eventually came to a kind of peace and acceptance of the fact that he was going to die alone in the canyon. Ralston made videos with his camcorder, saying goodbye to his friends and family. He also gave his last will and testament. He scratched his name, birth month, and year into the rock as an epitaph. He also scratched APR-03. On Wednesday night, having been stuck for 6 days, Ralston faded in and out of trances, hallucinating. He was delirious, dehydrated, and cold. Near dawn, he suddenly had a premonition of his future. He was playing with a blonde-haired 3-year-old boy in a red polo shirt. Ralston scooped the toddler up with his left arm, using his right stump to balance him, and swing the child up on his shoulders while they both laughed. This vision spurred Ralston on. Before then, he thought he would perish by himself in the canyon before help arrived. Now, he believed that he would live. By now, Ralston's eyes hurt every time he blinked. There was 5 days of grit built up on his contacts. His gums and tongue had grown raw from sipping his acidic urine. He poked the thumb on his right hand twice. The second time, he easily slipped the blade deep, which punctured the epidermis. Due to the gases from the advanced decomposition, his arm hissed like a balloon letting out air. He smelled a fainting, rotting stench. Suddenly angry, Ralston went into a rage, yanking his arm, struggling against the boulder. He discovered that his decomposing limb was pliable, and he had the epiphany that he could bend it against the boulder until his bones broke. Ralston violently bent his arm back and forth, using his body weight to exert pressure on his arm. Finally, the torque snapped his radius and ulna bones. He then used the dull blade of his multi-purpose tool to saw through the soft skin and tissue of his arm, carefully preserving the arteries. Ralston paused in cutting to apply a makeshift tourniquet made from the rubber tubing of his hydration pack, using his biking shorts for padding. He then used the multi-tool's pliers to sever his tendons before continuing to cut his flesh. Cutting through the main bundle of nerves was especially painful. Then, Ralston cut through the last piece of skin and was free. Later, Ralston said the amputation and bandaging took about an hour. Ralston described the moment when he walked out of the slot canyon as being reborn, because I'd already accepted I was going to die. Meanwhile, worried friends had filed a missing persons report on Tuesday night after Ralston had failed to show up for work for 2 days. The police traced Ralston's credit card. It had been last used to purchase groceries in Moab. Family and friends were convinced that Ralston had gone hiking near there. Authorities started checking the southeast corner of the county and luckily came across Ralston's truck at the trailhead of Horseshoe Canyon. Search and rescue started doing flyovers in a rescue helicopter. After the amputation, a bleeding Ralston crawled and climbed his way through the rest of Blue John Canyon. With his teeth and left hand, he slowly, painfully rigged his climbing ropes. He then rappelled one-handed some 60 feet down a sheer cliff face. It was late afternoon when Ralston finally made it to the canyon floor. In bad physical shape, covered in blood, Ralston staggered through the desert. He managed to hike nearly 7 miles before running into the Meyers, a family of Dutch tourists. They gave him some water and hailed a helicopter from the Utah Department of Public Safety flying overhead. Ralston was rescued about 4 hours after amputating his lower right arm. He was only about a mile from his truck when found. Rescuers helped keep Ralston conscious for the 12-minute flight to the Allen Memorial Hospital in Moab. When they got to the hospital, he amazed them by walking into the emergency room on his own. He was stabilized before being flown to St. Mary's Hospital in Grand Junction, Colorado for surgery. Ralston had lost around 40 pounds, including 25% of his blood volume. Rescuers said that the slot canyon Ralston was stuck in was so narrow that he would never have been spotted from the helicopter. Worried that hikers would make pilgrimages to see Ralston's arm and get into trouble themselves, park authorities retrieved Ralston's arm. It's said to have taken several men, a winch, and a hydraulic jack to move the boulder so that Ralston's severed arm could be freed. Since his canyoneering accident, Ralston spent 6 months making a complete recovery. He quickly learned to use a prosthetic and returned to the outdoor activities he loved so much. During the 1998-1999 winter season, Ralston had begun working toward a goal of being the first person to climb all 59 of Colorado's 14ers, mountains with peaks over 14,000 feet altitude solo and during winter. He had climbed 45 of the 14ers prior to losing his right wrist and hand in the spring of 2003. However, the accident hardly slowed him down. In 2005, Ralston, after 7 winter seasons, completed his mission. In 2008, Ralston traveled to the North and South Poles and also climbed Mount Everest. He continues to climb mountains and participate in a variety of outdoor pursuits. Ralston has appeared on several news and TV talk shows recounting his ordeal. He's made some other TV appearances too, including participating in a reality wilderness show, making a cameo on The Simpsons, and having been a game show contestant and winning $125,000 for a nonprofit land conservation watchdog. Ralston is also a motivational speaker and has given speeches discussing mental fortitude, overcoming adversity, and inspiration. He's also involved in wilderness advocacy. Ralston documented his accident in an autobiography, which has become a non-fiction bestseller. While people worldwide have been inspired by Ralston's almost superhuman tale of survival, those in the mountaineering community were less impressed. The first rule of backcountry adventuring is to tell someone where you're going or leave an itinerary of your plans. In his book, Ralston freely admits he's been sometimes reckless and stupid when it comes to taking risks in the wild. In addition to losing his arm, Ralston has been nearly mauled by a bear and was once buried in an avalanche. Aaron Ralston is not the only person to have survived a self-amputation. It's happened several times before. Notably, in 1993, 38-year-old William Jiraki was fishing a remote spot near St. Mary's Glacier in Colorado's Arapahoe National Forest when a boulder fell on and pinned his leg. For 3 hours, Jiraki called for help. The weather turned ugly, and without a jacket or supplies, Jiraki didn't believe he would survive the night. Fashioning a tourniquet out of his flannel shirt and using his bait knife, Jiraki cut through his knee joint, using hemostats from his fishing gear to clamp the severed arteries. He then crawled a half-mile back to his truck and managed to drive a half a mile to the nearest town to find help. It's been days trapped in the darkness deep beneath a mountain. The rain falls in torrents outside, which unbeknownst to you could mean the end sooner than you think. Your friends are quiet, and all you can hear now is the dripping of water on the cave walls. You're exhausted, hungry, clumped together with your buddies on a shelf in the cave where the floodwater hasn't yet reached, but you're aware it could rise at any time, and the thought of that horrifies you. What you don't know is that the world's media and the public is hoping and praying that you get out alive. Praying that you are actually still alive. You huddle against your buddy to keep warm. You keep still to preserve energy. You pray for rescuers, voices from the dark abyss. But as time passes, you start to lose hope. This is the story of the Thai boys trapped in a cave, one of the most heartening and fascinating tales that people all over the world followed from start to finish. It's a story of heroism, courage, and global collaboration, already a rescue epic in the annals of true survival stories. Those boys were trapped for 18 days, and you might wonder, just how did they survive and how did they get out? We'll start from the beginning. It was June 23, 2018, the birthday of one of the boys. He just turned 17 years old. At home, a SpongeBob birthday cake waits for him, but he won't ever see that cake. He is one of the older boys on a soccer team called the Wild Boars. The rest of the team were aged 11 to 16. There were 12 boys in total, and their coach, a 25-year-old named Aki. The team had been practicing that day in their village in the Chiang Rai province of northern Thailand. This is a beautiful part of the world with endless paddy fields, jungle-covered mountains, but also incredibly dangerous caves. It's rainy season in northern Thailand, and when it rains, it really does pour. Within minutes, streets can be flooded, rice paddies drown in water, and those living in the area are well aware of the dangers of such downpours. But the boys, in their excitement after practice, wanted adventure, and that led them to take their bicycles through the rice paddies and up toward the mountain. Up there was one of their favorite spots, the Tham Luang Cave Complex. They liked nothing more than to enter its depths and explore, but this was no day for exploration. Usually during the wet season, the cave is a no-go area due to the fact that heavy rains can fill the cave with water. The boys didn't care or didn't know, and they parked their bikes and went inside. It wasn't as if they hadn't done this before. In the past, they'd walked as far as 8 kilometers into the darkness, only with cheap flashlights, and for them it was kind of a dare, an initiation. This day was no different, and like before, they didn't only leave their bicycles but also their backpacks. The birthday boy's parents meanwhile waited at home, and it got darker and darker. Something was wrong. Little did the parents know that the team had ventured far into this massive cave, the 4th biggest cave complex in the country. If you translate its full Thai name into English, it reads, "The Great Cave and Water Source of the Sleeping Lady Mountain." That sleeping lady was known to have eaten people in the past, explorers who had entered and never come out. An expatriate guide working in Thailand later told the BBC that the cave was muddy and the water moved through it fast. On days of heavy rain, even the most experienced cavers wouldn't go near it. And so we have a bunch of kids who have walked far into the cave, and outside an almighty storm is broken. When darkness fell and the rains came harder, the parents talked about how some of the boys had discussed going into the cave. Now there was panic, and that panic turned into intense fear when the parents went into the cave entrance and saw their children's bikes and bags. Inside the cave, the boys now knew they were in trouble. Not only was rain falling outside, but it had been falling for days on end. Suddenly, they found themselves surrounded by rising water. A flash flood, it seemed, had occurred right around them. Their coach said, "Go, scramble, get out of here now or we're going to drown." They couldn't turn back, and so moved farther into the darkness. The trail they had used was now a river, a place of no return. They passed a place that usually stayed dry, nicknamed Pattaya Beach, but even that flooded. It was their favorite spot, too. Eventually, they managed to find a shelf where they could sit. Maybe they thought the water would recede, but it didn't, and they would sit there without food for 18 days. They had flashlights, but they were told only to use them now and again. This was no time to be afraid of the dark. Aki, the coach, did make one attempt to swim through the water, but he soon swam back. It was stay or die. They used rocks to make the shelf higher, so as to stay away from the water. In the pitch black, the coach told the worried boys that the only thing to do now was to stay calm. He had been a monk in the past, and he told the boys one way to get through this was to think of nothing, empty the mind, meditate, and that's what they did. They were also quite lucky because even though the body can go long periods of time without food, water is necessary. They didn't have to resort to drinking the muddy water from the floor because natural clean water dripped down the cave walls. They had enough air because of the porous limestone rocks in the cracks, although they didn't know that the oxygen level would get lower and lower. They could survive, but for how long? Ake later told the media, "I tried not to tell the boys that we got stuck in the cave. I only told them something positive, and that was it. They sat there and prayed and meditated and stayed calm, if not hungry as hell." Outside of the cave, a rescue operation involving people from all over the world was happening. Within days, there was hardly a news channel that wasn't following this operation. Thai police, government agencies, and Thai Navy SEALs were there, and unfortunately, one of those Navy SEALs would later die in the water. One problem is the complex was so massive and the boys could have been anywhere in that cave. Luckily, one boy who didn't go that day told parents and rescue teams that they'd like to go to a place called Pattaya Beach. That was some help. Divers from various countries turned up, including from the UK, the USA, Australia, and China, all working with the Thai divers. Many more experts from all over the world were also involved. It was one of the British divers that made first contact, and it was videoed, a scene that brought tears to the eyes of many people. Later, one of those divers told the BBC, "Wherever there's airspace, we surface, we shout, we smell. We smelt the children before we saw or heard them, and then they started to communicate with the kids." The Brit asked, "How many of you?" The boy shouted back, 13, to which he replied, "Brilliant. They were all alive. Many people are coming," said the diver. "We're the first." Hilariously, one of the boys then shouted, "What day is it?" They didn't quite know the day, but told boys that they'd been in the cave for 10 days. What they did know, they were in the dark with no idea how much time had passed. "You are very strong," shouted the diver. It was amazing to see those small kids all hanging together on that life-saving shelf. The divers then swam over to them using a line, and when they arrived, one of the kids said, "We're very happy," almost as if he learnt the line in school. The diver replied, "We're happy too." And when the world heard about this, it felt as if we'd been blessed by good news at last. The Thais smiled that day, celebrated after days of saying "su su," which translates to fight, fight. The boys had fought and they had won. Well, almost. They even had the opportunity to write on paper to their parents, with most boys saying they loved their mom and pop and not to worry, they were just fine. The parents wrote back saying they loved them. They had a special message for Aki, who had written to the parents saying how sorry he was that he had taken their kids into the cave. The parents parents wrote, "The moms and dads, none of them are angry at you. You went inside with them and you must come out with them too." But quickly, a new problem emerged, and it seemed that the boys were not out of trouble yet. Not by a long way, in fact. You see, they were found on day 10, and as you know, they didn't get out for quite a few days after that. These cavers that found them belonged to the British Cave Rescue Council, and they were joined by expert French and Belgian cavers. These are some of the best cavers in the world. They had literally risked their lives to find the boys, and as you know, a Thai Navy SEAL would lose his life. It was a perilous cave system, and it could take more lives. So how on earth were a bunch of kids with no equipment supposed to get back to land? It was around 4 kilometers of extremely dangerous diving, and outside the rain kept falling. It was by no means a certainty that the boys would make it, and again, the public prayed. About this time, the search had to be stalled. It was just too dangerous as the rains were too strong. Again, people all across Thailand joined in prayer and in their heads said those words, "Su Su." But now the outcome wasn't looking good. The boys wanted only one thing, besides being rescued. They wanted food. What did they want? They asked for pad krapao, which is rice with fried meat, chilies, and basil leaves. Unfortunately, all they got was a liquid diet full of vitamins because the doctor said it was what they needed, not a spicy dish with lots of oil. At least one of the boys got to celebrate his birthday with some hope. One of the mothers of the boys said to the press, "The Navy SEAL had practiced for so long and was so strong, but also died. How about a boy who's never dived before?" She was absolutely right. Tech wizard Elon Musk even offered to help, saying his engineers from SpaceX and the Boring Company would create a pod to bring the boys out, but a pod just wouldn't work in such tight conditions. The rescue was stalled for the moment, but then the bad news came. More heavy rain was coming, and if the boys were not taken out soon, they would be flooded and die in the cave. It was then that it was agreed that 5 Thai Navy SEALs and 18 foreign divers would lead the effort. It was said the weakest boy should come out first, but Aki said everyone was fine. No one was really weak. As it happened, the boys that volunteered first would go first. Aki actually said that the boys that lived farthest away could go first, as they had the longest distance to cycle home. He really had no idea that the world was watching them, that thousands of people were outside that cave. The British divers who found the boys led the operation, with many other divers following and many Thai divers waiting at checkpoints to get the guys through. As the boys could not panic, it was decided that they should be given anesthesia, so a doctor went along too. To get them out, first they had to be dressed in a wetsuit, and then a full face mask for oxygen was put over their head. They also wore a buoyancy jacket. After the anesthetic, they were rendered unconscious, and now it was about pulling them out. The problem was, or one of the many problems was, that the boy would only stay unconscious for 45 minutes, so the divers had to be trained by the doctor in how to give them anesthetic. The journey back took hours and was fraught with danger. At tight points, the boys had to be pushed hard through the cracks, but all the time the divers had to be very careful not to let anything push off their mask. The divers also held their heads high, so if anything did hit a rock, it would first hit them. We don't have to tell you that visibility was very bad. When they hit a dry section, they had to be dragged on a stretcher, their masks removed, and then attached again when it was back to another flooded section. Pulleys and chain systems were used to get them over sand, and they had to be carefully carried over rocks. It was a daisy chain operation involving hundreds of people. On July 10th, the last 4 boys were carried out to great applause outside the cave. It was reported that while some kids had incurred minor scrapes, amazingly they were all in good condition. The average weight loss was 4.4 pounds, which isn't so much for 18 days with nothing but water. They had to be quarantined because it was thought that they could have contracted dangerous infections, but they were fine. It was a bit sad though to see photos of their parents waving at them through glass walls. No hugging just yet. For a while, the boys also had to wear sunglasses as so much time in the dark made their eyes very sensitive to light. People tried to blame the coach for going into the cave during the rains. One British diver soon responded to that, saying, "Nobody's to blame, not the coach, not the boys. They were just very unlucky." It wasn't just the rain that day. The mountain is like a sponge, and waters from earlier rain were raising the levels. The coach himself, after the rescue, said, "I would like to express my gratitude for people from the whole world, officials and volunteers that came to help us. We promise that we will be good citizens to society." One of the boys that was rescued was called Titan, and he said this, "I was very happy to see my dad and mom. I feel warmer. I was very happy. I cried." We think quite a few tears were shed around the world when those boys were home safe and sound. Since then, the wild boars have toured the world and have done talk shows here and there. Many people won awards for their efforts during the rescue, and well, it's just a feel-good story all around. A group of POWs huddles for warmth in a dense, wet jungle. They haven't eaten in days and are dying from disease and are still forced to work 12-hour shifts by their Japanese captors. As they try to get some rest before another grueling day begins, they hear the screams of one of their comrades. They close their eyes and pray that the soldiers don't come for them next. Every night someone is taken, and the smell of burnt flesh fills the air. The fire where the meat is cooked casts long dark shadows through the trees of the jungle as another human being is eaten by cannibals. War can turn men into monsters. Perhaps there's no better example of this than World War II. In Europe, the Nazis were murdering Jews and people who didn't fit into their ideology by the millions. In the Pacific Theater, countless war crimes were committed by both sides, and it was here that a gruesome secret would be uncovered after the war ended. Not only were POWs being mistreated and tortured, but in some cases they were being eaten by other humans. We're about to investigate several cases of cannibalism during World War II. You might want to prepare yourself to be shocked and appalled, because there are no happy endings to these stories. On September 2, 1944, a squadron of American torpedo bombers flew towards Chichijima Island, located south of the main island of Japan. Each aircraft carried a crew of 3. As they approached the island, anti-aircraft guns let loose. Explosions filled the sky as shrapnel flew in every direction. A heroic pilot tried to evade the Japanese countermeasures, but the belly of his plane was struck by an enemy shell. There was a jolt through the aircraft as the engine began to fail. The pilot shouted back to the rest of the crew that they were going down. Before the plane went into a nosedive, the crew was able to drop their payload of 4 500-pound bombs. Their mission was complete, and they now needed to evacuate the aircraft, or they'd be killed on impact. The turquoise waters of the ocean could be seen on the horizon as the plane fell from the sky. There was no time to think. The crew strapped on their parachutes and jumped out of the aircraft while they were still over the island. The pilot kept the plane as level as possible so his crew had the best chance of making it out and deploying their chute safely. Once the last crew member was out, the pilot could bail. He was now over the ocean, but he had no other choice. In a split-second decision that would save his life, the pilot opened the cockpit and jumped. He landed in the waves of the ocean and engaged his life preserver. The plane continued gliding for a few more seconds, smoke streaming from its wings, and then crashed into the waters of the Pacific Ocean. The pilot looked to the sky and watched as his crew's parachutes descended toward the island of Chichijima and disappeared into its jungle. When the crew of the aircraft landed, they unclipped their parachutes and slowly made their way through the thick foliage. Unfortunately, the island was controlled by the Japanese, and enemy soldiers quickly located them. They held the American soldiers at gunpoint and led them to their encampment. It was there that the POWs were tied up and held captive. As the sun rose the next day, the Japanese soldiers began to torture the Americans for information. The war in the Pacific had been raging for almost 3 years, and both sides were looking for any advantage they could get. Throughout the war, POWs had been mistreated by Allied and Axis powers in an attempt to uncover valuable info, but this Japanese regiment would take things to a whole new level. The American airmen were stabbed with bamboo spikes, waterboarded, and beaten mercilessly. They didn't give up any information and refused to help the Japanese, which would cost them their lives. When the Japanese soldiers realized they would never get the information they wanted out of the Americans, they cut off their heads. The American soldiers' heroic actions would not become known until their remains were later found and their terrible fate discovered. It's unknown how much food the Japanese soldiers had on the island, but many claim that they were by no means starving, as there were plenty of resources available. This makes what happened next difficult to comprehend. When Allied forces took the island, the Japanese were forced to surrender. When the island was scouted and secured, the Allies found the remains of American soldiers that had been butchered and eaten. It was clear that the flesh had been cut from their bodies due to the knife marks on the bones. Japanese Admiral Kenisu Mori would later testify that their chef had pierced the livers of the American soldiers with bamboo sticks and cooked them with soy sauce and vegetables. It's been hypothesized by some that in certain Japanese belief systems, the liver is the part of the body where courage and power come from. By eating the liver of enemy soldiers, some Japanese military leaders believed that they would be given the power to defeat their adversaries. However, the liver was not the only part of the POWs that was eaten. Other Japanese soldiers stated that their commanding officer, Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana, ordered them to consume the flesh of 4 American soldiers who had landed on the island. The most disturbing part of all was that this was not an isolated incident. It's not totally clear what the motives behind the cannibalism on Chichijima were. Some of the soldiers who ate the human flesh might have been starving, but several accounts do suggest that the Japanese officers planned this human sacrifice on the island. Either way, 8 men who crashed on Chichijima were all killed, and at least 4 of them were consumed by Japanese soldiers. The day the plane went down over Chichijima, the pilot who bailed out just before the aircraft hit the ocean watched his crew land on the hostile island. When their parachutes disappeared into the jungle canopy, he began looking around for any form of rescue. There appeared to be nothing else around but waves and the debris from crashed aircraft as far as the eye could see. The current dragged him further and further out to sea. Suddenly, something started to bubble from below. The ocean's waters began to swirl all around them. It was as if a giant creature were ascending from the depths to eat him. The pilot tried desperately to swim away just as the top of a submarine broke the water's surface. It was the USS Finback. The submarine had been dispatched to find survivors from planes that had crashed during the air raid. Filled with joy, the pilot began swimming toward the Finback. He was worried about his crew, but there was nothing he could do for them at the moment. As sailors aboard the submarine pulled the pilot into their vessel, they asked what his name was. George H.W. Bush, the man replied. Unknown to everyone on board, they just rescued the future 41st President of the United States of America. George Bush continued on with the crew of the USS Finback to rescue more downed airmen. But the fate of the men aboard the plane wouldn't be known until years later. It wasn't until a researcher put all the pieces together and presented them to the former president in 2003 that Bush found out the gruesome fate he was saved from the day his plane crashed just off the island of Shishijima. This wasn't the only time that American soldiers would be tortured and eaten by the enemy. In another true horror story, 2 members of a downed B-29 bomber were captured and brought to a medical facility where they would undergo medical experiments. One medical student who was stationed at the facility recounted later that the men were brought into the lab blindfolded. They'd been injured when the bomber crashed and were led to believe that they were at the hospital to have their wounds treated. However, nothing could have been further from the truth. One of the U.S. soldiers was injected with salt water to see what effects it would have on the body. The other had his chest cut open and a lung removed. The doctors wanted to know how the respiratory system would respond with only one lung. These were only 2 of many medical experiments that were done on prisoners of war at the time. The most disgusting part is that some of the organs and body parts that were removed may have then been eaten by hungry Japanese soldiers. The war had taken a psychological and physical toll on many. Cannibalism was not an isolated incident, and it did not just happen on one island. In fact, there were accounts of cannibalism across the entire Pacific theater during the time, and each instance was more terrifying than the last. After the war, the atrocities of the Japanese Suzuki unit stationed in the Philippines were uncovered. The Suzuki unit was deployed into the Bukidnon region of the southern Philippines at the beginning of the war. Their mission was to combat any American or Filipino resistance forces in the region. Every day was hot and humid. The Japanese soldiers hiding in the jungles of the Philippine mountains would lose large amounts of water through sweat each day and expend vast amounts of energy just trying to hold their position. It was a brutal environment, and one that likely drove many soldiers crazy. The bugs would constantly be biting, and diseases would make life absolutely miserable. When the Suzuki unit had been deployed, they had only enough rations and resources to last them several weeks. But as the fighting continued and supply routes were cut off, they found themselves foraging for food and stealing from local villages in the mountains. As they continued to fight Allied forces, more and more Japanese soldiers started dying from malaria and dehydration from diarrhea. It was determined by doctors in the unit that the only way the men could stay healthy enough to keep fighting was if they had a constant source of protein. Unfortunately, this was hard to come by in the dense jungles of Bukidnon. The Japanese had killed and eaten local farmers' pigs, livestock, and chickens, and now the only source of protein left were bugs and other humans. The Japanese started to eat the bodies of prisoners who died from illness or injuries. There were also cases of POWs being executed for trying to escape and then immediately being flayed and cooked to feed the Japanese troops. In testimonies by Japanese soldiers, they described in detail how they would sometimes have to sneak into nearby Filipino villages in order to find the victims to cannibalize. In the cover of night, Japanese soldiers would enter a village. If there was someone out alone, they would come up behind them and render them unconscious with the butt of their gun before they could alert others in the village that something was wrong. The soldiers would then bring the victim back to camp, where they would cut meat from their skeleton and eat it to obtain the protein they needed. The human flesh would often be boiled with vegetables. Other times, it would be left out in the sun to be cured. The Suzuki unit's cannibalistic activity was likely done exclusively to stay alive, although surrendering might have been a better option in hindsight. When American forces captured the Suzuki unit and entered their camp, they were horrified at what they found. The human flesh was still in the process of being cooked, and human skeletal remains littered the ground. It became clear very quickly that the Japanese soldiers had been surviving off of human meat for some time. When the remains were examined, it appeared that many of the humans who had been consumed were Filipinos. 9 members of the Japanese unit were sentenced to death for their actions. However, many more likely ate human flesh at the time to keep from starving to death. Surrender was not an option for the Japanese, as they would rather fight to the death than surrender to the Americans and dishonor their country. This was true even if it meant hiding in the jungle and living off human flesh for years. Before World War II officially broke out in the Pacific, Japanese forces had been securing as many strategic points as possible. One of these places was Papua New Guinea. Japanese troops were sent to the region relatively early on in the conflict to establish airfields and naval ports to make attacking Australia possible. The Japanese captured soldiers from India, Singapore, and other parts of Asia who were aiding the Allied forces, many of which were then forced to build the wartime infrastructure Japan needed in Papua New Guinea. As Allied forces started gaining ground in the region, Japanese forces retreated further and further into dense jungles. They would take their prisoners with them to aid in building new encampments. Again, surrender was not an option for these Japanese soldiers, so they continued to fight even though the territory was all but lost. They eventually became cut off from supply lines, and no reinforcements would be able to reach them. As food ran out, the Japanese soldiers looked for other sources of protein. They originally tried hunting the Aboriginal people of Papua New Guinea, but quickly found out that they were too hard to capture since they knew the land better than anyone. They also tried killing Australian soldiers as a source of sustenance, but this proved to be too difficult as well, so they turned to the prisoners under their control. The Japanese needed them for manual labor, but the intense hunger pains began to overpower any rational thoughts. One Pakistani corporal who survived being a prisoner in Papua New Guinea recounted that toward the end of the war, Japanese soldiers were killing and eating one prisoner a day. The horrifying thing was that this lasted for around 100 days. It's highly likely that over 100 people were eaten by the Japanese soldiers in Papua New Guinea alone. But it gets worse. The other prisoners would watch each night as one of them was selected to be sacrificed so their Japanese captors could satisfy their hunger. The survivor said that whoever was chosen would be taken to a small hut where their screams could be heard echoing through the jungle. It appeared that they would be flayed alive. Those who survived having parts of their legs and arms cut off would then be thrown into a ditch, where they would bleed out as they prayed for death. When the Japanese soldiers were questioned about their decisions, some startling information came forth. The cannibalism was most often done for survival reasons, but not always. During one soldier's trial, he said that when he had killed and eaten an Australian soldier, it was for two reasons. The first was because he was starving, but the second and more sinister reason was that he had an intense hatred for the enemy. As horrendous and vile as these accounts are, it's important to remember that not every Japanese soldier was engaged in cannibalism. These were isolated incidents. On top of that, most would never have eaten another human if they were not dying from starvation. Early on in the war, intense bombings and fighting occurred within Australia and the surrounding region. The Japanese first attacked the mainland of Australia in February of 1942, when they bombed Darwin and Broome. By the next year, the Japanese had conducted 97 different air raids on the country. During this time, Japanese midget submarines were also entering Sydney Harbor and shelling the suburbs surrounding the city. The Australian military would capture the midget subs every once in a while, but whenever they opened the hatch, the two Japanese soldiers inside would be dead from self-inflicted gunshot wounds to keep them from being captured. It was when the Australians started pushing the Japanese back toward Asia that they uncovered the cannibalism of their own people. Australian troops would advance from one island to the next, making sure they were clear of any enemy presence. When they came to the larger islands of Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, they were met by heavier resistance. It was also here that they would come across abandoned Japanese encampments with human remains scattered around. Oftentimes, the bones showed signs of being butchered. Toward the end of the war, the Japanese soldiers that were left to fend for themselves became desperate. It's in the camps of these soldiers that more signs of cannibalism were found. As Australian soldiers and other Allied forces worked their way through the Pacific Islands and came across Japanese camps, they noted that several contained the remains of captured Australian soldiers. However, the only thing left of them were their hands and feet. Everything else had been eaten. So it would appear that cannibalism was happening all throughout the Pacific theater by groups of Japanese soldiers. It wasn't done by everyone, but some soldiers who were desperate to survive turned to cannibalism as a means to an end. As crazy as it sounds, eating another human was a better option than surrendering to some Japanese soldiers. That being said, the Japanese were not the only ones who engaged in cannibalism during World War II. When it comes to survival or death, people will do almost anything to stay alive. At the siege of Leningrad, starving people were seen eating the remains of the dead. It was cold, nothing would grow, and no supplies could enter the city. The only way to survive at that point was to eat anything that contained nutrients, including humans. There were even accounts of people cutting off their own flesh and consuming it as hunger overcame rational thought. Another example happened after the Battle of Stalingrad, where around 100,000 German soldiers were captured. They were sent to Siberia and Central Asia, where they were held in POW camps. The Soviets had very little sympathy for the Germans and didn't provide them with enough food or water. This led to the Germans resorting to cannibalism of their fallen comrades in order to make it through the brutal winters while locked up in the Soviet camps. To paint a picture of how dire the situation was for the Germans, out of the 100,000 that were captured, only around 5,000 survived until the end of the war. In the independent state of Croatia, which was set up and ruled as a Nazi puppet state, a number of concentration and death camps were established to carry out Hitler's final solution. It was here that the fascist Ustasha organization committed genocide against the Serbs and countless Jews to advance the Nazi agenda. It was recorded that when the Ustashas would slash the throats of their victims, they would hold a cup up to their neck to collect blood as it flowed out of the wound. The members of the Ustashas would then drink the blood in a ritualistic fashion. This brings us back to the point that not all cannibalism during World War II was for survival purposes. There are some that believe there might have been a cannibalistic cult-like understanding between certain officers in the Japanese military. There are several accounts given by different Japanese soldiers that said they were forced to consume human flesh and liver by their superior officers. In these situations, the men were not starving, and if they refused to eat the flesh of their enemy, they would have been chastised by their superiors. In extreme circumstances, soldiers were even physically forced to eat the human meat. It was said that officers who made their soldiers eat human flesh connected it back to the Sino-Japanese War that had taken place years earlier. Many of the imperial troops would regularly consume the flesh of their enemies to make them invincible in battle. Some of the higher-ups who were forcing their men to eat human meat in World War II had fought in the Second Sino-Japanese War, which had begun in 1937. And if you don't believe the Japanese and Allied soldiers' accounts of the events, there's a very blatant line of evidence that makes it clear cannibalism was a problem during World War II in the Pacific. A secret Imperial Army order was given on November 18, 1944 that directly addressed the problem of Japanese troops engaging in cannibalism. You might think it would directly condemn them, but that's not quite the case. In the address, the Imperial Government of Japan informed the troops that cannibalism was punishable by death. The caveat here was that cannibalizing an enemy was completely fine. The government was not promoting cannibalism, as the order mentioned eating humans as being the worst human crime and that it was due to a lack of thoroughness and moral training. However, as long as it was the enemy being eaten, it was not punished as a crime. At the end of the war, many Japanese soldiers and officers who were found to have engaged in cannibalism were tried for war crimes and sentenced to death. The Japanese government does not allow this part of Japanese history to be taught or discussed in public, as it's deemed too sensitive. Scholars who wish to publish information about the atrocities that happened during World War II have to leave Japan to do so. This is why several Japanese historians have sought jobs in Australia and at other universities around the world so they can accurately write about this time in history. It also cannot be overstated that cannibalism by Japanese troops was not the norm. There might have been a cult among certain military leaders that incorporated the ritualistic eating of the liver, but that has not been proven. Most soldiers who did engage in cannibalism did so to stay alive, just like many people have done throughout history in dire situations. The Japanese people were never a society of cannibals, and the atrocities that happened in World War II were never part of the Japanese culture. Suddenly, there was a thunderous rumble deep within the mountain, and everything shook. Dirt and rocks the size of a man's fist rained down. Amidst choking clouds of dust, they crouched low and ran for cover. It was every miner's worst nightmare, a cave-in. Thursday, August 5, 2010. The day began like any other day for the shift miners working at the San Jose Copper and Gold Mine in the Atacama Desert, 28 miles north of the city of Copiapó in northern Chile. However, about 2 p.m. local time, the mine had a massive cave-in. A group of miners working near the entrance escaped, but a second group of 33 miners were trapped 2,300 feet underground. Even worse, there were 3 miles of underground tunnels between them and the entrance of the mine. Soon, the whole world was watching as the race to save the miners unfolded. Were all 33 miners rescued? For how long were they trapped underground? How did they remain calm while waiting for help? Working at the San Jose mine was not only dirty and dangerous, but lonely too. The mine was open around the clock, with men usually working 7-day tours with 12-hour shifts. Most of the miners lived far away and would come to stay at the rooming houses in Copiapó to work for a period at the mine. While the wages were good, the job carried the possibility of death. Men had been digging for gold and copper at the San Jose mine since 1889. The whole mountain was a carved-out warren of pits, canyons, and valleys connected by passageways and roads. The central road linking all the tunnels to the entrance of the mine was called the ramp. The ramp zigzagged in a series of winding switchbacks down through the center of the mine. The men toiled deep in the bowels of the mine where there was still metal to be found. Geothermal heat radiating from the Earth's core made the mine hotter the deeper the men went. In addition to the heat, conditions were cramped, dusty, humid, and dark. The San Jose copper mine was also notorious for its poor safety record. Owned by the San Esteban Mining Company, the mine had a history of serious injuries and fatalities dating back many years. Several times the owners paid off victims or their families and got cases dropped. In 2007, after an accident, Cernajiomín, the Chilean government regulatory body responsible for supervising mining safety standards, ordered the mine closed. However, less than a year later, the mine was back in operation, having pulled some strings, even though it had not complied with the safety measures ordered by Cernajiomín. About halfway through the day shift on August 5th, an enormous block of diorite, estimated to weigh 700,000 tons, suddenly broke loose inside the mountain and fell through the layers of the mine, collapsing sections of the ramp and other passageways. Miners who were working on different levels sheltered in place and then headed for the designated shelter once the initial cave-in was over. At the small emergency shelter known as the Refuge, the miners discovered that all connections to the surface had been lost. This meant the electricity and the ventilation and intercom systems were no longer working. 54-year-old shift manager Luis Urzua and a small group of men went exploring to see if they could find a way to the surface. They were able to make it about a third of the way up an evacuation route, only to find that the mining company had once again cut corners and had not completed the emergency ladder, making it impossible to escape. Furthermore, within about 48 hours, another cave-in would completely block the emergency exit route. The miners were stuck. Meanwhile, in the Refuge, some of the miners had started eating cookies and milk from the emergency provisions. Many of them hadn't eaten since dinner the night before. Commonly, the miners avoided eating before their shifts to avoid vomiting caused by the brutal work conditions. When the search party returned to the Refuge, Urzua counted the miners. They numbered 33 in total, an unusually high number of staff. There happened to be several men working overtime, and actually no one man had met all of the other miners. Urzua took control. He was straightforward about the dire situation they were in. He took an inventory of the remaining emergency rations. There was 1 can of salmon, 1 can of peaches, 1 can of peas, 18 cans of tuna, 24 liters of milk, 8 of which turned out to be spoiled, 93 small packages of cookies, minus a couple packages that had already been eaten, and some expired medications. There were also 10 liters of bottled water. Additionally, there were thousands of liters of water stored in tanks, but the water was tainted with oil, having been used to cool industrial machinery. Meanwhile, on the surface, rescue responders, other miners, and miners' families rushed to the mine location to try to mount a rescue. On August 6th, rescue workers who were attempting to reach the Refuge via a ventilation shaft were forced to turn back when a new rock slide blocked the duct. When the president of Chile, Sebastián Piñera, learned of the cave-in, he realized that the government would have to take charge of the situation. The San Esteban Mining Company simply wasn't capable of mounting a complex rescue. Against his aide's advice, on August 7th, Piñera flew to the mine to meet some of the miners' families. The president committed to bringing the miners home, dead or alive, sparing no expense. The government turned to Chile's largest mining company, National Copper Corporation of Chile, or Codelco, for help. Codelco recommended Andrés Sugaret, a mining engineer with over 20 years of experience. To help him, Codelco handpicked a team of experts. The Chilean government also contacted other governments and mining experts worldwide. Over the next few weeks, various companies donated equipment, labor, and sent consultants and workers to help with the rescue. Also, private donations poured in to help cover the massive cost of the rescue, which by the end reached upward of $20 million. When Sugaret arrived on the scene, the San Jose mine was chaotic. Sugaret quickly established a perimeter, allowing only professionals in the restricted access area of the mine. A tent city, Campamento Esperanza, Camp Hope, quickly sprung up just outside the perimeter, populated by the press, miners' loved ones, and curious onlookers. Nearly every day, Sugaret personally updated Camp Hope on the rescue, often with the assistance of René Aguilar, a risk expert from Codelco with a degree in psychology. Sugaret and his team gathered as much information as possible to fully assess the situation. There was a chance that if the miners had survived the collapse and followed protocol, they might still be alive. However, the clock was ticking. If the miners were still alive, could the rescuers find them before they perished? Mining engineers began drilling boreholes 5 inches in diameter into the mine to try to locate the miners. This process was as difficult as finding a needle in a haystack. There weren't any completely accurate maps for the 121-year-old mine, and also drilling technology is imprecise. Drilling down to a target 2,300 feet deep with a 5% margin of error meant that the drills could end up anywhere in the base area of over 40,000 square feet. As the refuge was about 530 square feet in size, the chance that a drill would find it was about 1.25%. Meanwhile, down below, the miners were surviving on minimal rations. Each miner received 2 cookies, a spoonful of tuna, and a few ounces of milk mixed with water about every 48 hours. Urzua set up 12-hour shift schedules and used the headlights of the mining trucks to simulate sunlight. The miners established work areas, a sleep area, and a sanitary facility. Tempers frequently flared and the miners went through periods of hopelessness and lethargy. They itched and stank. Most quickly resorted to wearing as few clothes as possible because of the heat, but continued to wear their hard hats due to the mine's instability. Not long after the cave-in, one of the miners asked Don Jose Henriquez, a Christian, to lead a prayer. Though the miners were of different faiths, others joined in. Henriquez became known as the pastor and began leading men in daily prayers. The spiritual support helped bring unity and a sense of calm to the group. The men passed the time by sharing stories about their lives. They began calling themselves Los 33. On August 8th, 3 days after the cave-in, the men heard the unmistakable sound of a drill. They were excited, but knew it would take several days for the drill to reach them. The miners quickly resorted to drinking the industrial usage water as their supplies dwindled. They dealt with thick, sticky mud as the water used to limit friction while drilling seeped into their area. They despaired when they heard the sound of the drill beneath them. The rescuers had missed the refuge, drilling past it. By now, the miners were emaciated and sluggish. Hallucinations and nightmares were frequent. Many wrote farewell letters to their families. The rescuers drilled around the clock for over 2 weeks. On August 22nd, a borehole broke through to a ramp about 66 feet from the refuge. The miners used a wrench to tap on the drill bit. Up top, the rescuers thought they heard something and were excited to find notes attached when they pulled up the drill bit 3 hours later. One note said, "We are well in the shelter, the 33." The messages were carefully worded and dated, a sign that the miners were not disoriented. Making contact with the still-alive miners sparked a celebratory mood throughout Camp Hope and even all of Chile. The rescuers had a daunting task ahead of them. Now that they had found the miners alive, how could they sustain them and get them out of the mine? The rescuers quickly sent down a probe with a video camera. Next came a telephone receiver, then vials of glucose gel. Having consulted scientists from NASA who had experience in sustaining humans in the hostile environment of space, the rescuers slowly began to feed the men foods with specific nutrients, gradually increasing portion sizes, allowing for proper recovery. When the boreholes were being drilled, other teams of experts had brainstormed and tested various plans for rescue. None of the ventilation or existing evacuation shafts were considered viable, and they quickly realized that a rescue shaft was going to have to be drilled. It would be slow going through hard rock. The extraction shaft could take weeks, if not months. Ultimately, the rescue operation decided to pursue multiple solutions at once to ensure the best possible outcome. The plans known as A, B, and C employed 3 different drilling methods. Plan A was considered more reliable but was slowest. Plan B could be rapidly adjusted, but its technology was unproven. Plan C offered the greatest speed but less precision. Over the next 52 days, teams A, B, and C worked in parallel to drill rescue shafts. Plan A used a massive Strata 950 raise borer drilling rig to drill and widen a circular hole. Plan B used a Schramm Inc. T130XD air core drill, which implemented cluster hammer technology to widen existing boreholes. Plan C employed a Rig 421 oil drilling rig, which drilled a wide escape shaft in a single pass. Meanwhile, experts including the Chilean Navy and NASA worked on building and testing a steel rescue capsule for transporting the miners to the surface. The original borehole was widened so various items could be sent to the miners. Other boreholes were drilled for ventilation. The miners became active participants in their rescue. They moved to a new shelter in a less muddy area and reinforced the ceiling, removing loose rocks. Via phone, Urzua had frequent discussions with Sugaret regarding the technical aspects of the rescue operation. Newspapers, a palm-sized television projector, and gifts were lowered into the mine. The miners learned that they had become worldwide celebrities. Promises of fame and fortune and ongoing ominous rumbling from the still-shifting mountain exacerbated tensions between the 33 miners. Finally, the Plan B team broke through to the refuge on October 9, 2010. Plan A had drilled 85% or 1,962 feet of the required depth, and Plan C, which had suffered frequent setbacks, had only drilled 62% or 1,220 feet. Over the next 2 days, the rescue shaft was widened and portions of it were quickly encased for reinforcement. Safety tests were run. Finally, on October 12, 2010, just before midnight, the first miner got in the narrow capsule dubbed the Phoenix and began the slow ascent up the extraction shaft to the surface. Nearly 20 minutes later, for the first time in months, mine foreman Florencio Avalos felt the cool breeze of a spring night touch his face. He arrived on the surface to a cheering crowd, his eyes shielded by sunglasses for protection, since they were no longer used to bright light. One by one, over the next 24 hours, the miners were winched to the surface as the crowd cheered. President Piñera was on hand to greet each miner as they arrived. Overwhelmed, the miners happily reunited with their families. More than 1 billion TV viewers watched the rescue proceedings live. In all, the miners were trapped for a record 69 days, some 2,300 feet underground. There was a 17-day search to locate the miners, then a 52-day rescue, during which the miners had to be sustained and then hauled up to safety. No one has ever been punished for the disaster. In 2013, after 3 years of investigation, prosecutors said there wasn't enough evidence to file charges against anyone from the San Esteban Mining Company. The miners have had many problems since their ordeal. They were exploited by the media. Though they had some counseling, many suffered PTSD. After a whirlwind overseas tour, many had trouble reconnecting with family and settling down to ordinary life. The miners felt that they were cheated out of the profits of a movie made about their rescue. Many promised donations and job offers never materialized. Those of the 33 who wanted to return to mining had an especially hard time finding work. There was a stigma attached to them. Mining companies knew that they had government contacts, so they wouldn't hesitate to call if safety regulations weren't being followed. Nearly 10 years on, the San Jose Gold and Copper Mine remains closed. A small on-site museum displays relics of the rescue operation, honoring the bravery of the miners and the creative expertise and spirit of cooperation which succeeded in the miraculous rescue of Los 33. The weather was tens of degrees below freezing, and gale-force winds buffeted the two mountain climbers, both members of a mountain search and rescue team. The men were now attempting to summit New Zealand's tallest peak, Mount Cook. Yet their many years of experience rescuing others off dangerous peaks told them that it would now be them who needed rescue. With nightfall coming, the men knew there was only one chance for survival. They had to dig themselves a shelter and ride out the worst of the weather. With climbing picks and survival axes in hand, the two men began to hack away at the snow and ice, digging through increasingly worsening weather, knowing that their lives were on the line. The next day, and at the foot of the mountain, the two climbers had failed to check in. Don Bogey, one of New Zealand's senior-most mountaineers and search and rescue professionals, wasn't worried. He knew the two men, Mark Ingalls and Phil Dooley, and he knew that they were capable and experienced climbers. Besides, he himself had to spend the night on the mountain before, snowed in by bad weather. As long as they could find shelter, they could ride out even the worst of sudden storms. Back up the mountain, Ingalls and Dooley had both dug several feet into the snow and ice, digging out an ice cave in which to shelter. Because snow is such a good insulator, the cave helped trap their body heat. But the men had no wood or other material with which to start a fire. Their only source of heat was their sleeping bags and own body heat. With the temperatures steadily dropping and storm not seeming to let up, worry began to gnaw at the back of the men's minds. Already an icy chill gripped them, and even laying in their sleeping bags fully clothed wasn't enough to keep the cold at bay. To make matters worse, the men had only brought enough food and supplies for a few days' trek. They decided that they should start to ration, having no idea when the storm could let up. The men knew that storms on Mount Cook could be unpredictable, and the storm may break tomorrow or not let up for a week or more. Stretching out what food supplies they had would be vital. On such reduced rations, though, their bodies struggled to generate heat, which only worsened the situation very quickly, taking a turn for the disastrous. A few days later, Bogey was now extremely concerned. The storm blasting Mount Cook had not abated at all. Gale-force winds blasted the peaks and sides of the various approaches up Mount Cook, and anyone caught out in the open up there would not last long at all. Bogey held out hope that the men had found shelter, but he knew that the situation was very quickly turning grim. If the weather didn't break soon, they might have to send a search and rescue party out looking for corpses, not survivors. Thankfully though, the next day the weather cleared enough for a helicopter to start the search attempt. Bogey immediately volunteered to lead the search and rescue effort, and with good reason. Of New Zealand's search and rescue personnel, he was the most experienced at strop rescues, when the rescuers flown in a harness by a long tether at the bottom of the helicopter. The technique is incredibly dangerous and requires careful communication between the rescuer and the pilot, as well as nerves of steel for both. Unable to see below his aircraft, the pilot had to rely on verbal instructions from the rescuer on where to descend and how fast, or else the pilot may accidentally smash the rescuer into the side of a mountain. Yet, with no hope of landing the helicopter anywhere on the steep sides of Mount Cook, Bogey knew that this was the only way of rescuing the trapped men. Until the men's location was found, though, Bogey would ride inside the chopper, eyes glued to his binoculars as he and the pilot scoured the slopes for the missing men. In their gusto to find the climbers, though, they were forced to take unsafe risks, once nearly crashing into a ridge when gusts of wind blew their chopper off course. The weather was still ferocious, and the helicopter was struggling to retain control. It was unsafe for the rescuers, and yet Bogey and the pilot accepted the risk, knowing that they were the only chance that Ingalls and Dooley had for survival. Ignoring the many close calls and the danger, the chopper scoured the slopes, working by process of elimination and checking out huts and other places the men may be sheltering. Back in the ice cave, Ingalls and Dooley knew that they were in trouble. Severe frostbite had already affected them in their extremities, and both knew that they were going to be losing toes to amputation if they managed to return to civilization. Day by day, though, the chill grew ever higher up their legs. The extreme cold was limiting blood flow to their legs, and slowly, from the feet up, their legs were freezing and dying. Eventually, the chill would reach their torso, where it would be fatal. Food supplies were down to very meager rations, and with such low energy, their bodies struggled to generate enough heat to survive. Yet, from time to time, the men could hear the sound of a helicopter, unfortunately distant, but gradually working its way toward their location. The sound of possible rescue kept the men's spirits up, a fact that more than anything likely led to their ultimate survival. As any survival expert will tell you, when hope dies, the body is quick to follow. For days now, Bogey had been scouring the mountain by helicopter looking for the two stranded men. Then suddenly the weather broke enough to allow the helicopter to ascend to an area known as the Middle Peak. Taking the opportunity, the helicopter battled fierce winds and made the ascent. And as soon as they cleared the low clouds, Bogey was surprised to see the two men right there, waving up at him from below. The helicopter could not land, however, and Bogey would have to be strapped into his rescue harness dangling below the helicopter back down at the base, then be flown all the way back. The weather was still far too dangerous for this, and thus rescue would still have to wait. Instead, Bogey dropped the men down food, medical supplies, and a working radio so they could keep in contact. Grateful for the food, the men tore at the emergency rations, boosting their rapidly plummeting internal temperatures. The radio helped the men bolster their fading spirits as well, and jokingly, the men told their rescuers that they had settled into an ice cave that they dubbed the Middle Peak Hotel. Spirits and humor were still clearly up, giving hope to the rescuers that the men could be reached before they succumbed to the cold. Unfortunately, though, the weather refused to cooperate, and storms once more battered the area. The radio battery quickly died, cutting off contact between the men and the rest of the world. Days passed, and at last the weather cleared enough for an Air Force helicopter to make the ascent up the peak. On its way up, though, the helicopter hit dangerous turbulence, spinning it out of control and crashing it upside down onto an ice shelf a few hours' climb away from the men. Inside the upside-down chopper, 4 rescuers and 3 Air Force personnel pulled themselves out of the wreck. Having received only minor wounds, incredibly, the tail of the chopper hung right off a precipitous fall, and the occupants of the helicopter had avoided a several thousand-foot fall to their deaths by mere inches. A rescue for the trapped crew was immediately launched, but this tied up the only other remaining chopper, and the weather window to rescue the climbers closed. The next day, the weather remained relatively calm, and Don Bogey made up his mind. Today was it. They couldn't afford to wait another day, or he feared the men would die, and there was no telling if the weather would give them another opportunity. Despite conditions being less than optimal, Bogey strapped himself into his harness, and the helicopter slowly began its climb up the mountain, with Bogey hanging 100 feet below it on a tether. A disaster like with the Air Force helicopter would mean his certain death. Unknown to Bogey, it's very likely that Ingalls and Dooley would have in fact not lasted another day. Ingalls' frostbite was so bad that he could no longer stand, and Dooley was having trouble staying on his feet. Luckily for the duo, though, after a few hours battling the winds and weather, the helicopter reached them, and slowly Bogey was lowered onto the small ice shelf where the men were sheltering. Dooley happily greeted Bogey, but informed him that Ingalls could no longer walk. With great trepidation, Bogey told the pilot over the radio to give him several meters of slack on the tether, allowing Bogey to crawl into the ice cave and pull out Ingalls, who was still wrapped up in his sleeping bag. This was incredibly dangerous, as if the chopper needed to quickly rise or move due to winds, it would rip Bogey out of the cave and likely kill him in the process. Bogey, however, managed to drag Ingalls out and hook him up to a bag-like stretcher. Dooley would have to wait for his rescue, and Bogey and Ingalls were both lifted up into the air and then lowered down the mountain. With Dooley's position fixed, Bogey and the chopper quickly returned and successfully rescued him as well. The two men would survive their ordeal, though they would require amputations of both their legs due to severe frostbite. The men received prosthetic limbs and incredibly would continue climbing. Mark Ingalls would later become the first double amputee to summit Mount Everest. For his heroics, Don Bogey would be awarded membership to the New Zealand Order of Merit, in honor of his heroic accomplishment and determination in saving the two mountaineers' lives. When we think of hostage situations, most people think of fast and furious negotiations. We've all seen the news footage of bank robberies gone wrong, with heroic police negotiators making a deal with the captors while the hostages cower on the ground. If you're a fan of military dramas, you've probably seen a few heroic operations as Navy SEALs drop in to liberate Americans held abroad. But for many people kidnapped for ransom abroad, the reality of being a hostage is much slower and uncertain. For journalists Nigel Brennan and Amanda Lindhout, a journey into Somali territory turned into a 15-month ordeal at the hands of modern-day pirates. The Somali coast is considered one of the most dangerous places on the planet due to the loose government structure in the country and its struggling economy. The mostly agrarian economy has left the country one of Africa's poorest, and many young citizens have little choice but to turn to crime to survive. The waters off Somalia's eastern coast are a common shipping route for smaller vessels, and that makes the route a haven for pirates seeking to capture cargo or hostages. The most famous Somali pirate attack was the seizing of the merchant ship of Captain Richard Phillips, dramatized in the film Captain Phillips. But most operations by pirates are on a smaller scale, and that makes covering the area highly dangerous for journalists. In 2008, Nigel Brennan was a 36-year-old photojournalist from Australia covering conflict zones around the world. He traveled to Mogadishu with Canadian freelance journalist Amanda Lindhout to interview people at the country's IDP, or internally displaced person camps. Only 3 days after their arrival, their car was stopped by gunmen and they were captured. Other, more famous journalists in the area had beefed up their security due to increased pirate activity, so the pirates from the Hizbul Islam parliamentary group turned their sights to the new visitors. Brennan and Lindhout were about to become two of the world's most famous journalists, but for the last reason they would want. Brennan and Lindhout were taken along with their Somali translator Abdi Fattah Mohammed Elmi, their driver, and a driver from a nearby hotel, and blindfolded. Their teenage captors began driving them around the city to various locations, keeping them from getting their bearings. There was no initial announcement of their capture, and their friends, family, and employers back home were left to slowly realize that their trip to Somalia had gone very wrong. The captives were eventually taken to a rundown house where they were separated and kept in small rooms, mostly in the dark. The Australian government contacted Somali authorities and a manhunt began, but came up empty. At first, a spokesman for the pirates denied any involvement with kidnapping, claiming a fringe sect was behind it. Reporters Without Borders was able to get confirmation that the reporters were alive and unharmed, but the kidnappers had not made any demands. It wasn't until over 2 weeks after the kidnapping that the pirates were heard from, speaking through a third-party liaison. They demanded $3 million Australian dollars for the captives' release and allowed Brennan and Lindhout to speak briefly. Brennan was forced to issue a statement claiming, "We are very well now mentally and physically," while Elmi and the two drivers were released several months into their captivity after negotiation with tribal chiefs. The families of Brennan and Lindhout had little hope of raising money on their own. The Australian and Canadian government have a policy of not paying ransoms or negotiating with kidnappers, so the two captives were on their own as the months of isolation wore on. Brennan was kept separately from Lindhout, and both were treated roughly by their captors. Beatings were frequent, food was scarce, and Brennan knew that death could come at any time if the pirates believed no money was coming. They converted to Islam, hoping to ingratiate themselves to their captors, but the kidnappers were only interested in them for the potential payoff. Losing faith that he would be released or that his country would be coming to his aid, Brennan began to hatch a plan to escape. He was able to briefly communicate with Lindhout when their captors weren't watching by leaving tiny notes in the small bathroom they were allowed access to. When he developed dysentery, Nigel knew his time was running out. Living in the squalid conditions was wearing his body down, and escaping would become harder as he grew weaker. The pirates took Amanda to the desert and let her call her mother. What seemed like a kindness turned out to be anything but, as they reduced the ransom to $1 million but added a new condition. If it wasn't paid in a week, she would be killed. They both knew the time to escape was now. Nigel had been examining the bricks in his room and the bars on the wall for weeks, and they knew every inch of the place. The weak point was in the bathroom, in the slightly loose bars of the window. Nigel and Amanda waited for an opportunity, snuck off to the bathroom at the same time when their captors weren't watching, and worked together to loosen the bars until they were far enough apart. They carefully squeezed out the window, helped by the weight they lost in their long captivity, and snuck out. It was a 12-foot drop to the ground, but they landed safely. Freedom was within sight. Out of captivity for the first time in months, Nigel and Amanda ran. They spoke some basic Somali, enough to shout, "Help me, I am Muslim." They asked people on the street for help, but everyone turned away. The people in the streets of Mogadishu knew to fear the kidnappers and refused to intervene. Brennan knew the one place they might find help was in a local mosque, where they would be seen as fellow Muslims and find sanctuary. Their escape had been discovered, and their captors were hot on their trail wielding AK-47s. Nigel burst through the doors, yelling for safety, and the congregation of worshippers froze in fear. The one woman present embraced Amanda, and a worshipper handed Nigel a gun. Nigel stood frozen in terror as their captors burst through the door. The pirates demanded their captives back. Nigel stood trying to bring himself to fire, but he was a journalist and not a soldier. He couldn't kill anyone and surrendered his gun. The pirates threatened the mosque unless they were allowed to leave with their hostages, but some of the worshippers wanted to defend them. The mosque is a sacred place, and although they were scared, they were ready to defend their Muslim guests. They said an imam should be called to determine Nigel and Amanda's fate. The pirates were not willing to wait and roughly fended the worshippers off with threats of firing. They grabbed Nigel and Amanda and dragged them back to captivity. Nigel and Amanda's Somali nightmare was about to get much worse. Nigel and Amanda were brutally beaten in public by their captors as an example to anyone who would help them escape again. Blindfolded again, they were taken to a new safe house, chained in separate rooms, and kept in total darkness. The new rooms were like coffins, only 3 feet by 7. Nigel was forced to compete with large and aggressive rats for the little food they were given. Their captors went silent. Nigel and Amanda were no longer allowed to make calls to encourage their families to pay the ransom. Nigel began to sink into despair, sure that death was around the corner. But behind the scenes, their families were working to find them. Nigel and Amanda's families had been stonewalled by the government, who had come up empty in their search. Neither government was willing to pay the ransom, so the families hired private security firms who specialized in hostage negotiations. Although the families didn't get along and both blamed the other for their loved one getting kidnapped, they put their differences aside for the mutual goal. Nigel's sister, desperate to attain her brother's release, flew to Somalia to transfer money to a third party who knew the kidnappers. This was illegal and risked arrest, as well as putting her at risk of kidnapping herself. The families, with the help of rich private backers in both Australia and Canada, were able to raise over $500,000 for the release of the captives. The kidnappers, sensing a payoff could be close, loosened security on the captives and allowed them to make phone calls. This opened Nigel to another danger, being betrayed by his fellow captive. As their possible release got closer, both got paranoid, and a desperate Amanda used her phone to call to beg her mother to use the money to get her release even if Nigel would be left behind. Because the bank account is held in Nigel's native Australia, this attempt failed, and the release of the 2 hostages remained a package deal. With hope of the full ransom being raised dwindling, the pirates decided to take what they could get. After almost 460 days as hostages, Nigel and Amanda's release was close at hand. On November 25, 2009, Amanda and Nigel are dragged out of their cells and taken into a van. They're driven to the side of the road, where they're handed off to a third party. But they're not taken to another safe house. Instead, they're driven to Somalia's most secure hotel, where they go from the depths of squalor to the lap of luxury. They barely have time to process what's happening before they're taken to their plane the next morning and flown out of Somalia to Kenya, where they would be reunited with their families. Their hostage ordeal is over, but both will be recovering from their captivity for a long time. The secret behind the ransom wouldn't be revealed for some time. Both Nigel and Amanda's families were cash poor and had no hope of raising an exorbitant payment, but powerful private citizens in both countries worked together to bring their citizens home. Australian parliamentary leader Bob Brown and businessman Dick Smith, both active in Australian charity work, kicked in for Nigel's ransom. Calgary businessman Alan Markin was key in attaining Amanda's release. Although Nigel and Amanda were partners in captivity and in their daring escape attempt, the time as hostages had taken their toll on them and wore down their trust in each other. After being released, they went their separate ways and have not spoken since their ordeal. Nigel returned to Australia, where he recovered from his 15 months in captivity and parlayed his ordeal into a new career as an author. He co-wrote a memoir, The Price of Life, a true story of kidnap and ransom, with his sister Nikki and his sister-in-law Kelly, who were instrumental in campaigning for his release. His story was adapted into an episode of the TV series Locked Up Abroad, where he was portrayed by Tom Oakley. Nigel stayed close to home for several years, but made his triumphant return to the water when he participated in the Clipper Round the World yacht race in 2013. He spoke about the toll his ordeal had on him, and how traveling the world again was a big step in his recovery. While Nigel and Amanda were free, with Amanda going on to an acclaimed career as a motivational speaker, the masterminds behind their ordeal were still on the loose, and the governments wanted to make sure this wasn't repeated. Canadian police staged an elaborate undercover operation to lure one of the captors out of hiding. Al Omar Adair, one of the kidnappers and hostage negotiators, took the bait and visited Canada for what he thought was an opportunity, but was actually a sting. He faced Canadian justice and was sentenced to 15 years in prison for the kidnapping of Nigel and Amanda. The other kidnappers remain at large in Somalia, and authorities have no leads. Nigel Brennan and Amanda Lindhout survived an ordeal that would break many people. The average length of a kidnapping by Somali pirates is less than 90 days. They survived 5 times that, including beatings, starvation, disease, and a failed escape attempt that nearly led to their murder. It's early Sunday morning, a beautiful day to be headed out to sea. I'm a South Korean crew member aboard the massive cargo ship, the Golden Ray. While we're capable of taking on all manner of cargo, today we're hauling a load of automobiles and shipping cargo containers, full of all kinds of household and electronic goods. The Golden Ray is massive, the size of a 70-story building, and bigger than the aircraft carriers of World War II. But keeping her afloat is a challenge, and it takes the effort of the entire crew. The distribution of the weight around the ship has to be carefully calculated. Experienced ship captains called the Ray and the ships like her floating shoeboxes, given how very unstable they can become if the ship's load distribution isn't carefully managed. To do this, we assess everything we're taking on before letting a single item of cargo onto the ship, calculating exactly how much our expected load will weigh. Then, with the help of a computer, we plot where to place each item down to the very last car or shipping container. Even a tiny discrepancy in weight could result in disaster. This time around, we were a bit rushed in taking on our over 4,000 vehicles and a smattering of cargo containers, but the crew is still confident we did our jobs well. We're headed out of the port of Brunswick in Georgia and leaving the American East Coast behind. But first we have to cross the St. Simons Sound before making for open water. Hurricane Dorian grazed this part of the coast not too long ago, but the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers performed their usual post-hurricane assessment on the waterway and decided that it was safe for large cargo ships to cross. It's a great relief for me and the rest of the crew, as there's no telling what might happen if we were to strike a bunch of underwater debris. While the ship's thick steel hull would prevent a puncture, we're more worried about the ship's 2 propellers being damaged. These could take weeks to repair and would be a financial nightmare for the company that owns the ship. After a busy night loading cars and a few shipping containers though, it's smooth sailing out to open sea. We pass by many beaches and can see the American beachgoers gawking in awe at the size of our massive ship. I always like to watch people as we sail in and out of harbor. Getting to meet new people and experience new cultures is one of the biggest reasons why I became a merchant marine in the first place. Suddenly though, the ship lists slightly to its side, just a few degrees at first. I feel a bit of alarm rising up inside of me. The waters are calm and smooth. We shouldn't be feeling the effects of the waves at all. Something else must be wrong, I realize. A growing cold feeling of dread sneaking up my spine. As if to reassure my worst fears, the list suddenly grows worse, and what started off as a 2 or 3 degree list is now about 6 degrees. Across the various cargo decks of the ship, I can hear car wheels squealing as they slide across the floor. The brakes are engaged and they've been chocked in place, but the list is too great to resist. As the cars shift to starboard, I know deep down inside that the ship's fate is sealed. The comparison to shoeboxes by other sea captains aren't wrong. Our ship is very wide, and this makes it inherently unstable. It requires the careful pumping of fuel and water in ballast tanks to offset the effects of high seas or sharp turns. But nothing can stop the ship from capsizing if its entire cargo suddenly shifts to one side, as is happening right now. I can hear 16,000 tires screaming as their rubber squeaks across the stainless steel floor. I barely have time to react before suddenly the entire ship lists completely on its side. Furniture and all kinds of items go flying across the room, and I'm slammed into what was formerly the right wall of our engine room. With me are two other colleagues, and I watch one of them take a pretty serious blow to the head as he crashes against what was formerly the wall and is now our floor. The waters we're crossing aren't too deep, but deep enough to completely swallow up the golden ray. Escape from the room is impossible as the door outside leads to a hallway, which is now a vertical shaft. There's no windows here in the engine room, and we're basically deep in the bowels of the ship, so there's no hope of escape. The only thing we can do is sit tight and wait for rescuers. Luckily, we're not far from port, and haven't even cleared the sound to enter open waters yet. Without a doubt, dozens of beachgoers have already seen the accident, and must surely be on their cell phones calling for help, though hopefully someone in the control room got a radio call out before disaster struck as well. There's nothing to do but wait. None of my training has prepared me for this. We've been trained on how to escape the ship if it began to sink, how to fight fires, even how to secure cargo in raging storms, but nothing ever covered what to do if you were trapped in a ship capsized 90 degrees and escape was impossible. The engine room is hot, really hot. The engine stopped running shortly after the accident, and I'm grateful for that because any damage to the exhaust vents might have flooded the room with deadly carbon monoxide. Unfortunately, because the engine's cut off, the lights very quickly died, flickering off after a few minutes, which was all the battery power the ship had. That likely means that some of the batteries were damaged, but that doesn't matter now. I'm stuck alone in the dark with two other sailors, and the temperature is steadily soaring. Engine rooms on big ships are always hot, well over 100 degrees, but with no ventilation and the hot Georgia sun beating down on the ship outside, the temperature rises ever slowly upwards. As the hours go by, all three of us stuck in the engine room start stripping off clothes. We have no water, no food, and no cell phone or radio. Surely, though, people outside know that we're alive. All three of us take turns encouraging each other, pushing away terrifying thoughts of being left here to die. At least no water's entered the engine room, which means the ship isn't sinking. As the day wears on, though, the heat rises. I find myself wishing that at least part of the ship would flood. I'd give anything for cool, refreshing water right now. Suddenly, we can hear banging on the hull right outside our engine room. Shouting for joy, we pick up whatever we can find and start banging back. We barely hear a voice through the several inches of steel shouting back at us. "This is the U.S. Coast Guard. We will rescue you. Hope we're not going to steam to death in our overturned pressure cooker." An hour later, we can hear the sound of a blowtorch cutting through steel. We make sure to back away so we don't get accidentally cut or burned and await eagerly as the torch works its way through the thick steel of the ship's hull. After a half hour, we can start to see the metal on our side of the hull glowing cherry red. Then shortly after, the torch breaks through. It's a small hole, but it's enough to communicate with the people outside. The American Coast Guard has been pulling survivors out of the ship all day long, determined to save the life of every single crewman. I've learned that we're some of the last survivors being rescued, and that specialized equipment is being flown in to rescue us. The blowtorch can't cut a hole wide enough to free us. That would take far too long. So industrial cutters are being flown in for the job. For now, we have to remain in the overturned engine room. The heat is now over 150 degrees and it's hard to breathe. I feel faint and try as hard as I can to keep myself and the others awake. The hole that the Coast Guard cut was just big enough to push through bottles of water and food. And I didn't realize how dehydrated I was until I drank 2 bottles of water within seconds. I try to pace myself with the rest. I know that heat exhaustion can cause nausea and make you want to vomit the water you drink, which only adds to the dehydration. Right now, it's all about keeping our spirits up and surviving. Nighttime comes, and the Coast Guard officers outside the ship reassure us that they haven't given up on us. Don't give up hope, they tell us, and they push through more supplies. Someone always stays near the hole, so we have someone to talk to. And in the darkness, the voice of a friendly rescuer is enough to keep us going. The next day, just after sunrise, I can hear the sound of what must be the industrial cutters the Coast Guard has been waiting for. Diamond-tipped saw blades start chewing into the hull of the ship, but it's agonizingly slow going. The temperature didn't improve much over the night, and we're all starting to feel the effects of extreme heat exhaustion. Luckily, the Coast Guard keeps pushing through ice-cold bottles of water for us, and the cold water tastes like heaven. Hour after hour passes. The saw's gradually getting closer and closer, but impossibly slow. My head is swimming. The heat is so severe, it's really starting to get to me. I talk with the others and we sing songs to keep alert and keep our spirits up. After a few more hours, the saw blades are so loud that we can't hear each other unless we shout anymore. But at least that means the rescue is close. Finally, it happens. One of the blades cuts through the steel on the wall and slowly a large opening is cut into the engine room. Coast Guard rescuers are there waiting for us, helping to pull us out and along the small tunnel they've had to drill through the hull. In moments, I can see light for the first time in almost 2 days, taste fresh, sweet, beautiful air. Behind me, the air venting out of the engine room feels like a blast of a furnace, and the Coast Guard rescuers had to work with ice packs in their pockets just to stand the extreme heat. We are rushed off to the hospital, and later I learned that a fourth crewman was rescued from deeper in the ship. He'd taken refuge behind a blast-proof door, and that required a specialized saw to cut through. In the end, the ship is a total loss along with its cargo, but not a single one of us died, due in no small part to the heroic non-stop rescue efforts of the U.S. Coast Guard. Here you are again, entering the death zone of Everest for the second time in your life. And it's not just called the death zone to sound cool and attract more tourists. The region 8,000 meters above the ground earned its ominous name because of the high altitude and thin oxygen. 95% of climbers require extra oxygen here, and many have died. But that doesn't faze you. You're so close to the peak now that you can almost see the spectacular view in front of you and the sense of relief in your chest. Focused on your ever closer end goal, you take a look at the peaks below, and that's when you see the last thing you expected, a yellow blur to your left. What on earth could that be? You've not been in the death zone long, surely you can't be hallucinating already. And then you see it again. You shout at the group to stop for a while so you can take a better look. The others look toward what you're staring at and notice it too, so it must be real. But there aren't exactly many bright yellow things near the top of Everest. What could it be? Did someone drop their jacket? Did some scandalous littering climber leave some trash behind? Surely it couldn't be a person. You'd woken up early that morning with a sense of anticipation, knowing it would be the day you'd finally reach the summit. After years of training and preparation plus an eye-watering cost of 20 grand to get here, today was finally the day. It wouldn't be your first time reaching the peak, you're not some kind of noob, but still it was exciting. So you set off, feeling about as cheerful as a person who's about to enter a region with life-threateningly low oxygen levels can be, knowing you reached the peak within a few hours. But you'd not been climbing long before you caught sight of the mysterious flash of yellow, and it wasn't a piece of garbage or even an old jacket, it was a human, and he seemed to be alive too. It might not sound like a huge deal to run into a person even on Everest, but this guy was clearly out of his mind. He was sitting cross-legged on a tiny precipice with a huge precipice beneath him, flinching and swaying, and it seemed like he was trying to take his jacket off. This was a man who was probably hallucinating and suffering from frostbite and who knows what else. You wondered how long he'd been here and how long he had left. As you glanced back at your group, you realized that everyone was thinking the same thing. Yes, everyone looked concerned and worried about a man who may be on the verge of death, but there was also a sense of disappointment in the air. Why did this have to happen now, so close to the top? Instantly, you realized you were about to face an important and unenviable choice. Look after this man or reach the peak of Everest. There was no way you could do both. It's too dangerous to stay in the parts of Everest with the greatest altitude and the least oxygen. If you were to stay with the man long enough to guide him to safety, you'd have no chance of reaching the peak of Everest. Years of training and thousands of dollars down the drain just like that. And maybe you'd never get this opportunity again. Selfish as it sounds, it was hard not to be slightly resentful at the situation. But first, you needed to take a better look at the guy and see what condition he was in. So you began the descent to where he was perilously perched on the precipice, and by the time you arrived, he'd taken off his coat and was trying to strip down further. Quickly, one of your companions grabbed him so he couldn't remove more clothing, and together you made sure he put his coat back on. Even with a coat, it was hard to survive here for long. You're an experienced climber, you know what hypothermia looks like, and boy, was this man ticking all the boxes. It wasn't just him wanting to take off his coat, it was the way he was resisting your attempts to stop him like an angry child. You'd seen it before, and this wouldn't be the last time. As you first approached, he turned to you and said, "I imagine you're surprised to see me here." His words took you by surprise. Maybe he had his wits about him more than you expected. But these were just about the only droplets of sanity you'd get out of him. It soon became apparent that he had no idea how he got here or where he even was. However, he could tell you his name, Lincoln Hall, so it wasn't all that bad. Instead of realizing he was in the danger zone of Everest and sitting next to a dangerous drop, Lincoln seemed to think he was on a boat. He made some comment about what a great boat ride you were all on and got up, raising his arms as if he were about to launch himself off the boat and jump into the water. You and your companions jumped into action and managed to restrain him. Luckily, that wasn't too difficult considering Lincoln was so weak. You decided to keep him restrained on the ground. But who was Lincoln Hall? And how had a man who believed he was on a boat and wanted to take off his coat in freezing temperatures survived so long? So many questions. You rummaged through his coat pockets and bag, hoping to find some further clues about his identity or maybe some supplies. You found he belongs to the popular Seven Summits climbing group, but there were no supplies at all. He was here with zero oxygen and no food. Had someone abandoned him and taken all his stuff? Had another climber seen him alone and taken advantage by robbing him? Both of the possibilities seemed pretty bleak. It would have been nice to have had some extra oxygen up here, but you'd have to make do. You shared some of your oxygen with Lincoln and some snacks, which he ate under your careful supervision. Meanwhile, you tried to figure out what you'd do next. The whole group agreed you needed to call for help so he could descend to safety as soon as possible. The question was, would you stay with him or still try to make it to the top? You give the leader of the Seven Summits group a ring and were relieved to hear someone answer. You couldn't help but feel angry toward the group. Chances were the very people Lincoln had relied on to keep him safe had betrayed him and left him to die. Who would do that? You can hear the shock in the voice of the man who answers the phone when you tell him that Lincoln Hall is in fact alive. He explains that Lincoln's group had declared him dead yesterday and had been forced to abandon him. Last night? That meant Lincoln had survived in Everest overnight with no oxygen despite being severely ill. It was insane and completely unheard of. But the man tells you he'll send some Sherpas up to where you are to help carry Lincoln to safety and bring more essential supplies. You thank him. The Sherpas are an ethnic group native to the Himalayas, many of whom guide climbers due to their amazing capacity to withstand the coldest temperatures and their strength to carry essential goods. If anyone can come to this guy's rescue, it's probably them. Before hanging up, the man whispers to you that the job of the Sherpas is to guide climbers, not to die for them. You don't reply. Maybe that was true, but what about all the other climbers? Surely you can't have been the first person to come across Lincoln over such a large time span. Is this what climbing Everest has come to now? Finally, it was time for your group to make a big decision. You could leave Lincoln here alone and hope that the Sherpas would come and safely take him back to camp, while you made it to the peak of Everest like you dreamed you would. Or you could wait here with Lincoln and ensure he stays alive. Besides, what if the Sherpas didn't even come? You desperately wanted to make it to the top again. There's no feeling quite like it. And you wanted those in your group who'd never even known that feeling yet to experience it for the first time. Yet you also knew the taste would be bittersweet, knowing the sacrifice that had been made to get there, and if Lincoln didn't make it, you'd have to live with that forever. As you look at your companions, you only needed to share a few words to reach an agreement. You were going to stay here with Lincoln. So now there was nothing to do but wait here and hope for the best. You stay mostly in silence with Lincoln restrained on the ground. None of you say anything, but you're sure everyone feels the same way you do, mourning what could have been. You could have been reaching the top of Everest by now. Making the right decision was easy, but digesting the reality of that decision isn't. And it didn't exactly help to have nothing to do except sit and wait while a man lays beside you dying. After a few hours, you hear some voices. People, finally! Could it be the Sherpas? Not quite. Instead, you see two dark-haired men speaking in what sounds like Italian, but still, they should be able to help, right? At first, it seems like they're trying to avoid eye contact with you. Surely they can't have failed to see a relatively large group acting so unusually. You call out to them and explain that you need help, that there's a man here who's on the verge of death. They shout down that they don't speak English and briskly walk off. As they disappear, you struggle to process what just happened. Since when were language skills a prerequisite for carrying a man to safety or offering an oxygen mask? Well, bugger it. There's nothing for it but to sit here and wait for even longer. Just as you were about to lose faith in all humanity and suspected that the guy on the phone had been lying to you about helping, a group of Sherpas showed up. Slowly and gradually, you make the long walk down, taking it in turns to support Lincoln as he staggered and struggled. How had this guy survived so long? It was a journey of mixed emotions, knowing your journey was over prematurely, but that you'd most likely saved someone's life. It was an 11-hour trek down to the North Col camp, 7,000 meters above the ground. Hall was then taken to the base camp, and you were left to make the journey down on your own time. Everyone was safe now, but there was still plenty of questions hanging in the air. What exactly had happened to Lincoln before you arrived? And would he make a full recovery from such grotesque damage? Only time would tell. A few days later, you reached the base camp and prepared to visit with him. In a bizarre twist of events, you chanced upon none other than the Italian climbers who had ignored your plea for help the previous day. And yep, you guessed it, they were speaking English perfectly now. But on to Lincoln. The guy wasn't exactly in perfect health. 6 of his fingertips had been removed due to frostbite, and he also had suffered water on the brain. But he was looking well compared to when you last saw him. At least he didn't think he was on a boat ride anymore. He explained the truth of how he'd ended up alone in the death zone of Everest. Turns out that Lincoln was an experienced climber and had made it to the peak of Everest before, but this time, as he was descending back from the summit with his group, he suddenly started to feel very ill and weak. It was a sign of cerebral edema, a type of brain swelling that leads to hallucinations and fatigue. He remembered asking his companions if he could lay down at the top of the mountain, and his group had needed to carry him down. The Sherpas had tried to revive him with no luck. Lincoln only got sicker and sicker to the point where the Sherpas declared him dead after he'd shown no signs of life for 2 hours. Worried about running out of oxygen and causing more deaths, they opted to leave him for the greater good of the group. And before they went, they took all his supplies for their own use, like the oxygen mask and food. Nobody was sane enough to have a good idea of what had happened after that, but it seems like Lincoln probably fell asleep then wandered off, gradually getting sicker. We'll never truly know how he survived. He's not the only one who has survived such a crazy feat. Another climber, Beck Weathers, was left for dead on Everest but ended up making his own way back to camp. Unless you're in the medical field, you might not be familiar with the term iron lung. In fact, we're willing to bet that some of you might hear that phrase and instantly think of that indie horror video game where you play someone trapped in a submarine. But in the medical world, this has a completely different meaning. Now, of course, nobody gets put in an iron lung for no reason. It's not exactly a pleasant experience for patients who require this kind of ventilation treatment. Iron lungs themselves are like large person-sized canisters designed to help someone breathe if their muscle control has been lost. As you might already know, the process of filling the lungs with oxygen and expelling carbon dioxide requires the contraction of several muscles throughout the human body. You don't just need lungs and clear airways to breathe. And unfortunately, some infections out there can prevent the muscles from performing in the way that's needed for a person to successfully breathe. And as you can probably imagine, it's a pretty dangerous state to be in, so that's where an iron lung comes in. Or at least, that's where iron lungs used to come in handy. Nowadays, the large, cumbersome breathing machines have been rendered mostly obsolete as medical technology, especially ventilators, have advanced. However, recently during the 2020 pandemic, some places saw a renewed interest in the device. Iron lungs were thought to be potentially a cheaper alternative to more modern ventilators, especially during the times when there were higher numbers of patients in need of treatment for COVID-19, but fewer ventilators available to meet the demand. But what was it actually like being inside one of these medical contraptions? Just taking a look at the large, cumbersome coffin-like cabinet doesn't conjure up any ideas that it was a fun time. But to give credit where credit is due, the use of the iron lung saved a lot of lives in the first half of the 20th century. You see, it was during this time that the iron lung was developed as a way to help treat symptoms of another life-threatening infection, polio. Polio is a disease that only occurs naturally within human beings, and it is highly infectious. Catching it would often occur if someone's hygiene was poor or by eating food or drinking water that had been contaminated. Major polio outbreaks began to occur across Europe and the US during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and sadly, many of those who suffered with it the worst were children. The virus often manifests in symptoms like a sore throat and fever, with some of the more severe cases often including headaches, neck stiffness, and paresthesia, which is an abnormal sensation affecting the skin but with no apparent cause. Perhaps most worryingly though, around 3/4 of all polio cases were asymptomatic, meaning that a person might not be able to tell if they had contracted it until it was too late. Some cases of polio could lead to total paralysis or death, with those lucky enough to survive experiencing continued muscle weakness thanks to post-polio syndrome. So picture yourself during this time just going about your business. Maybe a few days earlier you were exhibiting some mild symptoms, or maybe there were no early warning signs at all. Then you gradually start to feel as if you're out of breath. You try to fill your lungs, maybe slow your breathing down and take a few gulps of air, but something is making it harder and harder for you to breathe. Your neck might be hurting too, or you might have developed a headache. It gradually gets worse and worse, and you're struggling to function, to move or hold things in your hand, even swallowing or coughing. Then all of a sudden you're struck with the terrifying sensation of being totally breathless. Your lung muscles have been paralyzed, and you're left gasping for air. The one saving grace is that you have a loved one on hand to rush you to the hospital just as your symptoms are starting to go from bad to worse. Then imagine you woke up in an enormous metal cylinder. You'd be sealed up to the neck inside what looks like a coffin on legs. All around you would be the sound of machinery, a noisy whooshing, the whole thing wheezing and sighing. You wouldn't be able to move, to speak, and in some cases you might not even be able to see, thanks to a hood around your head. but at the very least you'd be able to breathe again. As terrifying of an experience as it might sound, this was the reality for many patients who contracted polio and had to be placed in an iron lung in order to assist their breathing. As incidents of polio rose across Europe and North America, the disease reached a high enough level of infection rate and had spread wide enough for it to be considered an epidemic. At its peak in 1952, there were well over 57,000 cases of polio in the United States within a single year. As well as causing headaches and fever, the paralysis triggered by a polio infection had a severe effect on the chest muscles, which are responsible for aiding and regulating breathing. Without the aid of medical apparatus, a patient couldn't breathe normally and would, in all likelihood, die as a result. Luckily though, Philip Drinker and Louis Shaw, two professors of industrial hygiene at Harvard University, came up with a solution, a respirator that was nicknamed, yep, you guessed it, the iron lung. Mechanical devices to assist with a person's breathing weren't a new idea at the time, but the sheer scale of the polio epidemic forced Drinker and Shaw to come up with a ventilator that could allow patients suffering from airborne illnesses to potentially survive the effects on their lungs by being able to breathe closer to how they normally would. While originally designed to treat coal gas poisoning in the late 1920s, the iron lung would soon become renowned for its use in treating the respiratory failure that could occur as a result of contracting polio. While at Harvard in 1928, Drinker and Shaw developed the first widely used version of the device. It consisted of a huge metal casing with a bellows attached at one end to pump air in and out. The bellows is used to create a blast of air, normally by squeezing a flexible airbag between two rigid boards. Even if you've never heard of such a contraption, you no doubt would have seen one used in older animated movies and TV cartoons, where bellows are often used to stoke a fire, as they commonly were in the real world. Those attached to the iron lung worked with the same principle, expanding and contracting to circulate air throughout the metal chamber. The body of the iron lung itself was airtight, so a person encased within one would have to keep their head outside, their neck supported by a tight rubber seal to ensure the air couldn't escape from within the ventilator. The initial version of the iron lung, invented by Drinker and Shaw, was often referred to as the Drinker respirator and was powered by an electric motor. This powered the bellows, which would change pressure within the airtight chamber of the iron lung. This would effectively pull air in and out of the lungs of the patient inside, practically doing the breathing for them. Now, at first, the adoption of iron lungs into hospitals was nowhere near as widespread as their usage would later become. After all, Drinker and Shaw could hardly mass-produce enough of their newly designed ventilators to meet the demand created by such a widespread epidemic. So, as a result of this, many hospitals had to first create improvised iron lungs with the materials that were available to them before the large-scale manufacture of the apparatus began. Applying the principle the assisted breathing machine was meant to work on, doctors and hospital engineers had to jury-rig something as close to an iron lung as possible in order to allow their patients to breathe if their lungs failed. One of these custom-built iron lungs wasn't even completely iron. Used in Lansdowne Hospital in Cardiff, Wales, was one that consisted of an iron bed frame with a wooden box affixed to it. To ventilate, there was a set of leather bellows from a metal forge mounted on top of the wood. These had to be cranked by hand. Although homemade, this version of the iron lung operated in much of a similar way as the more technologically advanced successors would, inflating and deflating a patient's lungs by alternating the pressure in the box with the bellows. Luckily though, after using their improvised version between 1941 and the late 1950s, this Welsh hospital would eventually receive a more up-to-date model of the iron lung. As with any new innovation, especially one that addresses an issue as prevalent as polio, it did not take long for there to be more than one type of iron lung available to the public. The earlier Drinker respirator design set the blueprint for the devices, but was more of a large, angular, boxy contraption, which, while functional, was cumbersome and cost a lot to manufacture, meaning not all hospitals could afford to buy one, let alone the number they would need to treat all their polio patients. So enter a man named John Emerson. In 1931, he designed and improved a version of the iron lung. The key difference? This one was not only far more affordable, but also provided greater access to the patient contained within. Where the Drinker version of the iron lung was constructed primarily of opaque plate metal, Emerson's improvements involved incorporating changes in the original device's design that would make them more convenient for hospital staff to keep an eye on their patients. The Emerson iron lung had portholes in its side, offering a view of the patient's breathing without having to open the machine, and risk affecting the air pressure within. Another of Emerson's innovations would make the bed inside the iron lung slide in and out of the metal cabinet, making it easier to place a patient inside for treatment. However, despite the changes that Emerson's design introduced, Drinker insisted that Emerson had copied the design from his original version of the lung, and that this constituted a breach of Drinker and Shaw's patent. They ended up suing John Emerson and took the case to court, where his lawyers argued that the iron lung couldn't be patented. After all, Drinker and Shaw's version had been based on pre-existing technology, and by proving this, Emerson was declared the victor of the lawsuit. The judge presiding over the case also agreed that a technology such as the iron lung, being actively used to save lives, should be shared and made accessible to as many people as possible. This was only proved even more true when another polio epidemic broke out a few years afterward in Australia. Only 6 years later, in 1937, the number of polio infections in the country were rapidly climbing. But due to the astronomical cost of not only purchasing Drinker respirators, but transporting them all the way around the world to Australia, a more easily accessible alternative was required out of necessity. And so the Both respirator was created. Much like the Emerson version before it, this new iron lung improved on the weight and cost issues of the Drinker invention, created by a biomedical engineer named Edward Both, after the South Australian Health Department asked him to come up with a cheaper alternative. However, unlike both its predecessors, this iron lung was built using plywood. This not only made the manufacture of them incredibly cheap compared to other metal versions, but also much lighter, so they could be transported far easier. Some of the Both respirators even saw their first use only a few hours after they were constructed, rushed out to hospitals to begin treating polio patients. A British philanthropist and car manufacturer named William Morris was so impressed with Both's iron lung that he personally financed the production of the new model, overseeing the creation of around 1,700 of the machines at his motor manufacturing factory in the UK. Morris, who was also a lord, then donated the Both iron lungs to various hospitals around the world. Well, those within the British Empire at least. Much like the Drinker respirator and the Emerson iron lung that preceded it, Both's version of the machine applied the principle of negative pressure ventilation, artificially pushing air into a patient's lungs to aid in the respiration. The attached bellows would extract air from the main chamber of the iron lung while the patient was sealed inside and the container kept airtight. Then, as the internal air pressure began to lower, their lungs would expand, drawing fresh air into their diaphragm. The machine's bellows then reintroduced air into the iron lung, creating a rise in air pressure, which would push the air out of the patient's lungs and cause them to deflate. This created a rhythmic sound as the air circulated within the iron lung, which provided doctors with reassurance that the patient was once again breathing. But what was it actually like to be inside an iron lung from the patient's perspective? We've explained the science of how an iron lung functioned and even some of the history behind its development, and why it saw a rise in usage thanks to the polio epidemic. But for those who found themselves needing to be placed inside an iron lung, the experience could be bewildering, unfamiliar, and even downright frightening for some, especially for the number of young children who were unfortunate enough to contract polio. And that was just what the experience of receiving treatment could be like. And if that wasn't enough, the point at which many patients were placed within these cumbersome ventilators was usually when their polio was causing them intense pain and even delirium, thanks to their inability to breathe, causing a lack of oxygen to the brain. This was the reality for one such patient, a man named Paul Alexander. In 1952, at the age of only 6, Paul contracted polio, and the virus would ultimately leave him paralyzed for the rest of his life. During the polio epidemic, most businesses had been shut down, particularly those that encouraged large groups of people to inhabit the same space, whether sealed indoors or staying outside but remaining close together. If you have any vivid memories from the initial COVID-19 lockdowns, then you probably remember a lot of similar mandates happening at the time too. This meant no movie theaters, bowling alleys, bars, or even public swimming pools permitted to stay open. Yet it did little to stop the rising number of polio cases as the summer of 1952 rolled on. In July of that year, a young Paul Alexander was playing outside when he began to exhibit his earliest symptoms: pain in his neck and a severe headache. Upon seeing his condition, his mother sent him to rest up in bed, where Paul would spend the next few days. His fever climbed and he experienced aches and pains in his arms and legs. Yet his parents were advised by a family doctor not to take Paul to the hospital. It was clear to the doctor that the boy had contracted polio, but with the sheer number of patients already suffering from the virus, the local hospital was too overcrowded to properly treat the young boy. Although the doctor claimed that Paul had a better chance of recovering by staying home, over the following days his condition only worsened, to the point where he struggled to speak or even cough. He was rushed to the hospital, where the staff took him to the dedicated polio ward, but given the high number of patients, they were overwhelmed and unable to treat Paul immediately. And sadly, he wasn't the only sick child who was suffering. When a doctor was eventually able to see Paul, there seemed to be nothing that could be done for him, and he was left on a gurney barely breathing. Had another doctor not decided to examine Paul a second time, then he most likely would have died. But luckily, this doctor performed an emergency tracheotomy, suctioning the congestion out of his lungs. Then Paul Alexander was placed in an iron lung. Already, this had to have been a harrowing experience for the poor child, and waking up to find himself inside a strange machine could not have provided much in the way of comfort, even if he was thankfully still alive. Awaking in an iron lung, Paul was unable to move or speak, and was no doubt terrified to find himself encased in a big wheezing machine. The iron lung he had been placed inside had a steam tent and a vinyl hood that surrounded Paul's head. This was designed to keep his head moist and keep the mucus in his lungs caused by the polio loose. However, his mechanically assisted breathing had fogged up the window. With no idea what was going on, a young Paul thought the worst. Fortunately, despite his fears, he had not died. When the hood was removed, Paul was able to see again. He noticed he was in a room surrounded by other children, all with their heads sticking out of iron lungs. There were rows upon rows of fellow polio patients, all encased in metal canisters, while nurses wandered between them. Being inside an iron lung was difficult both for the patient and the medical staff charged with their care. Having one's entire body from the neck down, trapped within a breathing machine, meant none of the patients could use their hands, and many were so weakened by their polio symptoms it made movement next to impossible. As a result, doctors and nurses had to work around the clock to provide blood transfusions, intravenous glucose feeds, inserting and replacing patients' catheters, and endlessly checking that the iron lungs were working as intended. The help provided to patients wasn't just limited to strictly medical procedures either. Itches needed to be scratched, noses needed blowing, and everyone needed to be thoroughly washed without exiting the iron lung. So these tasks fell to the nurses, most performed through the portholes in the sides of each lung, provided the hospital had Emerson or both versions of the device. In some instances, the patients were able to exit their iron lungs to undergo physical therapy, but they only had a few minutes worth of breath outside the metal ventilator. For Paul, the 18 months that followed his awakening inside of the iron lung were far from easy to get through. Thanks to the emergency tracheotomy he received, he couldn't speak, although he could hear the frightened cries of other children experiencing the painful symptoms of polio. As he soon learned, life on the inside of an iron lung was incredibly boring, especially for a child who would rather be outside and active. Many iron lungs were fitted with mirrors so the young patients could easily see what was going on around them, and Paul would often use this to communicate with his fellow patients by making faces at them. Those who were lucky could have books suspended in front of their faces, but someone needed to be around to turn the pages. Unfortunately, the survival rate for polio, even among patients who were being treated within iron lungs, was not perfect. Many still died, including those on Paul's ward. He remembered that every time he made a friend with another patient, they seemed to pass not long after. As for Paul himself, he made a recovery from his initial polio infection, however he was left paralyzed from the neck down. The regular change of air pressure inflating and deflating his lungs within the ventilator was literally keeping him alive. If ever the staff had to open his iron lung, poor Paul was forced to hold his breath until they restarted the machine. Although he would live for many more years, Paul needed the support of an iron lung for the rest of his life. As an older man, he described a vivid memory of overhearing doctors talking about his condition. Often, as they did their rounds, they would remark that they didn't believe the young boy should still be alive, or that any day he would succumb to his polio. As Paul recalls, it angered him, but it kept him determined to survive the ordeal within the iron lung. Over time, he was gradually able to leave his iron lung for extended periods of time, and Paul would go on to live to this day at the ripe old age of 77. He also holds a Guinness World Record for being the person who spent the longest amount of time living in an iron lung, as well as being the only person alive today to live inside an iron lung, as Paul still needs to be placed inside to aid his breathing. While not typical of all polio patients or even all of those who were treated via the use of an iron lung, Paul Alexander's story does provide us with one of the best, most detailed descriptions of what it was like to live inside an iron lung. In one of the most remote and unforgiving wildernesses in the world, two strangers sit huddled in a makeshift tent they've built. The man and the young woman are freezing and on the verge of death. A snowstorm batters their makeshift tent. The wind blasts seem to the pair like nature itself has a vendetta against them. They're miles away from any town, and what they don't know is that as they sit and wait, the media is saying there is little hope the missing pair will be found alive. The storm abates, and suddenly the woman sees a plane in the sky, but her hope is crushed as it fades into the distance. "In the name of God," she says, "please come back." She's well aware she doesn't have long to live. The story starts at the beginning of the 1960s, a decade that would become renowned for its decadence and colorful youth culture. Just prior to that decade, there was the Beat movement, a counterculture that enshrined something that would become known as the road trip, with Jack Kerouac's book On the Road inspiring many young Americans to take off and explore their own country from end to end. And that's just what a young Jewish girl from New York named Helen Klaben wanted to do, to follow in the footsteps of people who turned away from convention and instead went looking for adventure. When Klaben was just 20 years old, she saw an ad in a newspaper asking if anyone wanted to share the gas costs and take a car all the way to Fairbanks, Alaska. She replied, and the two set off on a long journey. After a few months in Alaska, she knew where she wanted to explore next, and that was the mystical East. She wasn't sure where she'd go exactly, maybe India, maybe Hong Kong, but before that she had to get to a destination to take a flight across the world. That destination was San Francisco, a city on the verge of a cultural revolution. Early in 1963, Klaben met a 41-year-old Mexican-American amateur pilot by the name of Ralph Flores. He was an aircraft mechanic that hailed from California, and he too wanted to get back home and leave Alaska. The pair agreed to share the expenses of the journey, and off they went to their first destination, which was the capital of the Yukon Territory, Whitehorse, the most populated place in that wild part of the world. They had another stop after that, and that was at Fort St. John in British Columbia. It was winter and bitterly cold. Snowstorms raged and the plane was grounded for 3 days. A small single-engine airplane couldn't hope to fly over such an unforgiving territory in such bad conditions. Nonetheless, with the weather warning still present, the two took off again into the sky. Their next landing would be anything but smooth. The pair flew for hours in strong winds, the plane being tossed around like a dandelion seed in a strong breeze. Flores could hardly see anything with the snow blasting against the plane. He and Klaben knew they somehow had to get out of that storm, so Flores attempted to get above the clouds and out of danger. His plan was to come back down and find the Alaska Highway, which would lead him to the airport. That was the thing. He needed the road to get his bearings because, being an amateur, he didn't quite understand the instruments in the aircraft. On top of that, he hadn't even packed emergency supplies on board in case of a crash. There were no real tools, not much in terms of food supplies, nothing to keep someone warm, and not even a gun in case they came up against a rather hungry animal. The Yukon is full of bears, small ones, large ones, and utterly fearsome ones. They at least had a knife. It was a time of desperation, and Klaben started to lose her cool. She knew that the pilot was totally lost, but he refused to admit that. Then she suddenly saw a mountainside and some trees, and she knew they were going to crash. She said to herself, "Okay, Helen, here it comes." And it came with a bang. She closed her eyes and just hoped for the best, and when she opened them, she was alive. The plane had landed at the side of a mountain close to the Yukon-British Columbia border. She had a broken arm, and she had some broken ribs and a fractured jaw. There was nothing but mountains and trees around, and snow covered everything. Just walking around was an effort because the temperature at times would go down to negative 45 degrees Celsius. They huddled in the wreckage of the plane to escape the blistering cold. Frostbite was a certainty in these conditions if they stayed out too long in the open. As days went by, search parties flew over the skies and looked for the pair, but it was incredibly difficult to see anything in between the trees when everything is covered with snow. They literally had nothing to eat after they finished off some cans of sardines, tuna, fruit, and some crackers. There were no supplies at all after that, and they were only 10 days in. The one important thing they could do to survive was to melt snow for water. They had a box of matches and so could make a fire. With both of them in pain from their injuries and without the equipment to hunt, they just sat and waited and starved. Day by day, the pounds came off as their bodies burned their own fat reserves. Flores did try and make something that looked like a slingshot, but it was useless, and he soon gave up on hunting rabbits. They did have another thing though, and in a way you might call that an emergency supply for the religious mind. It was a Bible, something Flores took everywhere with him since he'd converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was a devout Mormon. He told Klaben that this crash they'd experienced had some significance in regard to the bigger picture of things. He told her to read the Bible and they would be saved. She had to convert. Each day, they heard planes rumbling overhead, and each day Klaben continued reading the Bible, hoping her devout accomplice was right about his God. He actually told her that if she read the whole thing and then accepted the divinity of Jesus Christ, they would be saved. She wasn't exactly comforted by this and didn't believe him, but hey, there wasn't that much reading material in the middle of nowhere. Weeks now passed and they made a discovery. They found toothpaste, and that suddenly started looking tasty. Each day they squeezed the tube and gratefully swallowed the minty cream. They knew it wasn't really sustenance, but it was at least something to put in their mouths. They also had chewing gum, and they chewed that for weeks on end. Things got desperate after a few weeks, and while they could at least keep themselves a little bit warm with insulation they made out of clothes and cushions, Klaven got serious frostbite and then gangrene in her foot. She could now hardly move at all. She was all but ready to give up the ghost and had lost about a third of her body weight. Flores just told her to keep reading that Bible and never give up hope of a rescue. Still, as time went by, even he seemed to have given up on one of those planes in the sky seeing them. Flores then told Klaven that since he could walk, he would go and try to find civilization. He walked off in the woods, leaving her behind to her own thoughts. She decided to write about what happened, but soon gave up on that when it started to sound like an epitaph. She wasn't ready to sign off just yet. 8 days later, and Flores came back. He told his dying companion that he had at least found what looked like a clearing, and so humans might have been there. There was also much more chance of someone seeing them from the sky once they were away from all the trees. They had to walk there and make a shack of some sort. It took hours to get there. Klaven's foot was badly infected now, and the pain of walking was unbearable. As they got closer to the clearing, they heard a noise, like a humming, in the distance. Flores went in search of that noise and then returned sometime later. He told Klaven he'd found a frozen pond and that he'd written SOS in it, and also etched the shape of an arrow that pointed to where they were. He'd done this with the snowshoes he'd made out of tree bark. He told Klaven he'd go out again with a mirror and try to catch sight of the pilot. She didn't want to be alone again, but he assured her that it was the only option now. Was there hope? It was day 47 of their ordeal, a day after Klaven had finished reading the Bible. And now we introduce you to a man of the wild, one Charles Chuck Hamilton. In March that year, as those two were freezing and starving to death, he was out in his plane trying to spot animals to hunt. He had a good eye for that kind of thing. He spotted no moose that day, but he did see SOS written into what looked like a frozen pond. He didn't immediately think about the missing plane. That had been weeks ago, and it wasn't something that was still on his mind. In fact, he and his passenger thought that the remark must have been left by a trapper, seeing as trappers did sometimes find themselves in difficulty in the wild. At the same time, Klaven had seen the plane in the sky. She made a fire and frantically threw green pine on it. Black smoke gushed into the sky. Surely, someone would see that. She was now in tears, full of desperate joy, ignoring the pain in her foot. Flores was out in the woods trying to use the mirror to flash sunlight back at the plane. Hamilton actually had to turn away from the black smoke since it was so thick and heavy, but it was then he saw a man standing with a mirror in his hands. Hamilton found a place to set down the plane near a cabin on an airport lake. He was about 6 miles away from the pair. Trappers were working at this cabin, and that's the noise the pair had heard. The trappers had been cutting firewood with the chainsaw. All these men got together with their dogs and set off to find the man with the mirror. Because of the smoke, Klaven hadn't yet been seen. Hamilton then left the trappers and said he'd investigate from the sky again, but now that fire had died down. When he looked at where the fire had been, he could just make out a tent. He then made a radio call and said, "I think I found the lost people." Night was now falling, and so Hamilton returned home, hoping the trappers had found those people. The media called him all night long, but he couldn't sleep anyway, thinking about the poor souls alone out there. At this point, no one knew if there was just one survivor or two, since only the man with the mirror had been seen. Hamilton only guessed the woman was the source of the fire. The trappers actually did find Flores that night, but Klaven waited the whole night alone at the shelter. It was now pitch black, and the rescue would have to wait until morning. Hamilton actually turned to his wife and said, "What if she's dead when I get there?" He flew off before dawn and landed a couple miles from where that tent was. From there, he walked in, and about 1 hour later, Klaven saw a hulk of a man striding toward her. A man she said was pixie-faced. When he met her, she embraced him and cried and kissed his grizzled cheek. The brave woman said she could walk out even with a terribly infected, frostbitten foot. Hamilton responded to that, saying, "If I can carry a moose out of the woods, I can carry you." It took some time, though, walking on snowshoes with a woman on his back, a frail woman at least, who now only weighed 100 pounds. When Klaven was finally taken to a hospital, the doctor said she wouldn't have lasted one more night. Had they stayed another night, that SOS in the lake would have been covered. They were discovered in the nick of time. When Klaven was well enough, she met with a host of reporters, to whom she acclaimed, "Hey, I'm alive!" She was all good except a few missing toes. Klaven soon went back to Brooklyn, and Flores went home to his family in California. She never did convert and become a Mormon, but she later said the ordeal did make her more spiritual. The experience, she said, helped her to find herself. In an interview, she said most people expect they'd not be able to cope with the crisis, and it was a great experience to find out that I could. Klaven wrote a book about what had happened and never lost her her sense of adventure, traveling through many regions of Asia and Europe and the Americas. She died in 2018, aged 76. Flores was also 76 when he passed away in 1997. So we guess these two had one last experience they could share. The now old Chuck Hamilton left the wilds and moved to Victoria, where he lives today with his family. He keeps a token of the event in his basement, a bit of the wreckage with the serial number N5886. Sometimes you just can't take the stairs. Maybe you're tired after a long week, maybe you're carrying something heavy, or maybe you suffer from limited mobility, such is the case of wheelchair users or the elderly. In times like this, the humble elevator, an invention that's been with us in some form since even the Roman Empire, is a godsend. So you step inside, you press the button corresponding to your intended floor, and wait. From there, you're on Easy Street. Or so you'd think. Because when you're unlucky, this mundane contraption has the potential to become your final resting place. Take the horrifying case of Marites Fortaleza, a mild-mannered 53-year-old housekeeper from Queens. Fortaleza worked for the owners of a 5-story townhouse at 48 East 65th Street on the Upper East Side, near the iconic Madison Avenue. If you have even a passing knowledge of New York real estate, you'll know that you need somebody to be absolutely loaded to afford a place like that. Warren Stevens, the billionaire investment banker who owns the place, definitely fits the bill. He and his wife Harriet bought the home for a stunning $8 million in 1999. Marites probably felt lucky to score such a lucrative position until one fateful Friday night in January of 2019. The Stevens were away for the weekend and Marites was doing her regular cleaning duties when she decided to take the home's private elevator back to the bottom floor. That's when disaster struck. The elevator jammed in the shaft during the descent, and just like that, Marites Fortaleza was stuck. Unlucky for her, this elevator didn't have a working phone or an emergency button, which is a legal requirement for private elevators in New York that aren't continuously monitored. In other words, with the owners away for the weekend and no means of communicating with the outside, she was in deep trouble. If you suffer from claustrophobia, you're probably already sweating. But here are a few more frightening facts. While someone can starve for as long as 70 days before dying, dehydration can take as little as 3 days to become mortally dangerous. 3 days, that's just a long weekend, which seemed to be exactly what the Stevens were taking. If Marites didn't get extremely lucky, then time really wasn't on her side. Right now, you're probably thinking, this is scary, but it's a freak accident. There's no reason to be concerned about stepping on an elevator. And sure, you're mostly right, but this isn't an unprecedented case. Even in New York City alone, elevators are notoriously prone to malfunction. Back in 1999, the same year the Stevens bought the house that Marites Fortaleza was currently trapped inside, Nicholas White, a production manager for Businessweek magazine, underwent a similar ordeal. The hardworking 32-year-old, much like Marites, was preparing to clock off on a quiet Friday evening. Feeling tired from a long week, he decided to take the elevator down from his office in the Midtown Manhattan high-rise where the magazine was based. When the metal doors shuttered behind him, it was 11:24 p.m., and Nicholas was one of the last to leave. Just as he was probably thinking about how to spend his weekend, set to the ambience of tinny elevator music, the elevator jammed just above the 13th floor. Talk about an unlucky number. Naturally, he was calm at first. After all, it's not uncommon for elevators to get a little jolt now and then. But when it became apparent that he wasn't going to be moving again, the panic started to set in. He screamed and yelled, trying to attract the attention of someone outside, but nobody was there to hear him. He pressed every single button on the interface but had no luck. He even attempted to call maintenance and was met with no response. It wasn't until he'd spent over 40 hours in the elevator that he was eventually discovered and freed. Nicholas was shaken by the experience, refusing medical treatment because he just wanted to go home and sleep the whole scary incident off. The McGraw-Hill Companies, the parent entity of Businessweek magazine, naturally had some questions as to how exactly Nicholas could remain undetected for so long. This wasn't a private residence like the house where Marites Fortaleza found herself trapped. It was a 50-floor building owned by the Rockefeller Center Management Corporation. When asked, they passed the buck to New York electrical company Consolidated Edison. Con Edison did admit that at 11:21 p.m. that same night, they did experience a voltage dip lasting 1/10 of a second, which may have accounted for some of the malfunction. However, this still doesn't account for why nobody was monitoring the elevator and why it took almost 2 days for Nicholas to be noticed. One theory is that the cameras the building claimed to have for the elevator shafts were just largely for show, rather than the live feeds that were actually being routinely monitored. In the end, we'll never know exactly why Nicholas White spent 40 hours in the elevator shaft. Nicholas himself was just eager to put the whole thing behind him. But while she was still trapped in that tiny personal elevator, that was a luxury that Maritas Fortaleza didn't have. As the hours passed, it was probably beginning to dawn on Maritas that she might not be saved in time. There was no food, no water, and perhaps most uncomfortably of all, no bathroom. According to U.S. life insurance statistics, the odds of dying in an elevator are 1 in 10,440,000. But New York State has a population of almost 20 million people, so maybe she was about to get unlucky. After all, accidents happen. Another similar accident occurred in New York City in 2005, 6 years after Nicholas's unfortunate incident in Manhattan. Ming Kwang Chen, a 35-year-old delivery man for the Happy Dragon, a Chinese takeout restaurant in the Bronx, mysteriously disappeared during a delivery to one of the Tracy Towers, a pair of 38-story apartment buildings at 40 West Mosholu Parkway near Jerome Avenue. When Ming didn't return from his delivery and his bicycle was found chained up outside, his friends, family, and employers feared the worst. After a series of deliveryman homicides that had taken place over the last 5 years in New York City, they thought Ming had been murdered. Police began looking into the matter immediately. They canvassed the area with cadaver-detecting police dogs, sending police scuba divers into the nearby Jerome Park Reservoir, and asking door-to-door at the over 800 apartments in the Tracy Towers. They discovered that Ming had made all his required deliveries before vanishing without a trace. Little did they know, as they practically turned the building and its surrounding area upside down in their search, Ming Kwang Chen was actually right next to them the whole time. He'd spent the last 3 days and then some without food and water, trapped in a malfunctioning express elevator. He'd been trapped for over double the time that Nicholas White was locked in, clocking in at a terrifying 81 hours. Ming had been screaming desperately for help the whole time, but nobody had heard him. Much like White's case, the circumstances of how Ming could be trapped for so long is a little mysterious, with the building managers insisting that the cameras in the building were still fully functional. Ultimately, Ming was just happy to be free, though he was understandably shaken by the incident. He was treated for dehydration at a local hospital before being questioned by the police about the strange incident. Ming had managed to make contact with the building maintenance over the intercom several times during his confinement, but being a relatively recent immigrant from the Fuzhou region of Fujian province in southeastern China, he couldn't speak fluent English. The language barrier kept building maintenance from being able to fully understand and help Ming, keeping him trapped in his 4x6 prison. All in all, Ming was just grateful to be free in the end, though the incident may have soured him on the delivery driver profession. The cruel irony of where he was trapped wasn't lost on Ming either, as he commented that the people in the Tracy Towers apartment building had always been lousy tippers. Plenty of people out there have elevator horror stories, some more mild than others. Brian Acott, a man from the UK, was trapped just above the ground floor of his office building, but managed to pry the doors open and climb free. A Canadian man interviewed by the BBC, who identified himself only as Don, recounted the time he was trapped in an elevator on the 55th floor of the Empire State Building when he was 11 years old. He, his aunt, and 2 Danish tourists were trapped in the elevator for around an hour and a half, during which time he had to urinate in the corner. In one particularly funny example of an elevator mishap, Kenny Wheeler, another guy from the UK, was trapped in an elevator at his place of work for just under an hour. After nobody responded to calls for help, he posted a Facebook status update to try to get the people's attention. 10 of his friends liked the status, though only one actually called his place of work and got him freed from the elevator. But it isn't all fun and games. Lydia Carey from Nairobi, Kenya, was trapped in an elevator with a stranger high on an unknown drug. 19-year-old Australian student Kaleem Limbruggen caught some terrifying cell phone footage when he was trapped in an elevator packed with 14 people before the elevator began hurtling downwards at 90 miles per hour. Miraculously, nobody was seriously hurt in the incident. This was the kind of incredible luck Maritas Fortaleza needed as she sat in the darkened New York elevator, waiting and hoping to be rescued before it was too late. Of course, not everyone is lucky in a situation like this. Elevator malfunctions have been responsible for some pretty horrific deaths. Take the harrowing story of Miss Wu, a 40-year-old woman in the Gaoling district of Beijing who died a death you probably wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. She became trapped in a broken elevator in her apartment building, which 2 repair workers had left in an unusable state without proper signage for 30 days. She was trapped inside the elevator the entire time it was out of commission, resulting in a grim and lonely death from starvation and dehydration. Ms. Wu became an unwitting martyr for the cause of better public maintenance in China after a series of deaths resulting from horrific elevator and escalator accidents that were the direct result of shoddy maintenance and repair. Ms. Wu's death can actually be directly linked to one negligent action from the 2 workers tasked with turning off the elevator's power. They called into the elevator to check if anyone was in there, but didn't, as regulations dictate, pry open the doors to check if anyone was inside. If they'd done this, Ms. Wu may not have suffered such a horrible fate. Though she is not the only one. Many people have fallen to their deaths down elevator shafts, and in one example that feels like a scene straight out of a horror movie, a doctor in Houston, Texas named Hitoshi Nikaido was decapitated by an elevator, which cut off his head above the lower jaw, causing it to land in the car of the elevator. The experience was something out of a nightmare for one of his co-workers, Karen Steinau, who was trapped inside the elevator with the doctor's severed head. It's hard to even imagine something more horrifying than this. While Maritas Fortaleza was neither decapitated nor trapped in an elevator with a decapitated head, death from dehydration in the vein of Miss Wu was a real threat. As the hours drew on, she began to doubt that anyone would come to save her. Trapped without anything to pass the time, she began to lose all sense of how long she'd been in there. Would she just be another statistic? Another name to reel off in an article or a video about strange elevator-based deaths? Well, luckily for Maritas, the Stevens were about to receive a delivery. When the delivery worker arrived on Monday, they were unable to deliver the package, so they contacted the Stevens. The Stevens then contacted a family member who could go and collect the delivery. The family member finally noticed that Maritas was trapped inside the broken elevator and finally called the authorities. Police and firefighters managed to safely rescue Maritas Fortaleza from the private elevator of the Stevens 5-story townhouse. Like all locations where a lot of people congregate on a daily basis, accidents happen in elevators. Sometimes these accidents can lead to pretty horrifying consequences, but other times, such as in the case of Maritas Fortaleza, you just get lucky. Open sores cover his body. Worms have embedded themselves into his pus-filled flesh. His feet are covered in blisters. On the verge of death, Yossi Ginsburg knows he must stimulate his body to continue pushing forward. He spots a nest of fire ants in the leaves of a tree, and moving underneath it begins to shake it violently. The furious ants rain down on him, angrily biting and chewing at his flesh. It's torture, but the bites also release bursts of steroids from his body's reserves, energizing him to continue moving, to not lay down and die. Things will soon get worse. The son of Holocaust survivors, Yossi Ginsburg enlisted with the Israeli Navy at the age of 19 to fulfill his mandatory military service in his home country of Israel. An adventurer at heart, Ginsburg dreamed of sailing the 7 seas, but it wouldn't be until he completed his service in 1981 that he'd be free to travel past Israel's immediate territorial waters. Ginsburg was inspired by Papillon, written by Henri Charrière. In his autobiographical work, the novel details a purported escape from the French penal colony of Bagna de Cayenne, a brutal prison off the coast of French Guiana, also known as Devil's Island. Charrière details his escape from this deadly prison and the subsequent adventures abroad that ensued, setting fire to Ginsburg's imagination. He too wanted dangerous adventures and the opportunity to visit uncontacted indigenous tribes in the deepest jungles of the world. Ginsburg made up his mind to save up enough money to embark on a legendary adventure to find Charrière himself, as well as the many uncontacted tribes he had detailed in his book. This would take him into the deepest, darkest parts of the Amazon. But this only heightened Ginsburg's anticipation. He worked every job he could, saving every shekel he earned in anticipation of his grand adventure. His first job was working construction in Norway, after which he flew to Alaska to join the dangerous fishing fleets of the legendary Bering Sea. After saving up a good chunk of money, Ginsburg drove from Alaska to the lower 48, stopping to visit the city of sin itself, Las Vegas. In just one very ill-advised night of gambling, Ginsburg lost almost everything he had, putting his dreams of Amazon travel in serious jeopardy. Ginsburg got turned onto a job in New York, however, working for a friend's uncle. From New York, he traveled to Africa for his new job, shipping old music records to be resold in African markets. While in Africa, Ginsburg slept inside the container of trucks he drove in order to save money and rebuild his savings. Unfortunately, Ginsburg discovered that just as he had saved enough money to embark on his adventure, Charrière had already died. Further dampening his spirits was the realization that the tribes he had longed to travel to and live amongst had already been officially contacted and brought into the fold of the modern world. Ginsberg's mind was made up though. If his icon was dead and the tribes he longed to meet were already contacted, then he'd just travel deeper into the Green Inferno and discover new tribes. Ginsberg soon arrived in Venezuela, but was immediately discouraged by the discovery that government efforts across South America had brought previous uncontacted tribes into contact with the modern world. His disillusion growing by the day, he hitchhiked his way down to Colombia, where he boarded a ferry ride that would change his life forever. The captain of Ginsberg's ferry decided to abruptly turn around after being told that a passenger had just arrived and missed the boat. Had that ferry captain not turned around to pick up this straggler, Ginsberg's life may have perhaps been more peaceful than it would become. It certainly would have saved him a trip to the heart of hell itself. On the dock was a Swiss school teacher, Marcus Stamm. As the two chatted on their boat ride, they quickly struck up a friendship. Stamm was like Ginsberg, also an adventurous spirit, and enjoying the final few weeks of his year-long break from his job teaching in Switzerland. With no real destination in mind, Ginsberg was easily talked into crossing over to Bolivia, and the duo headed up to La Paz, the capital. There, the two new friends were approached by an Austrian traveler, Karl Ruprechter. At first, Ginsberg and Stamm were suspicious of this character, but then Ruprechter began weaving together a story they couldn't resist. He explained that he was a geologist in search of a secret gold hotspot deep in the Amazon. The location was completely uncharted and had been revealed to him by sources familiar with the still uncontacted indigenous tribe who lived there, the Taramonas people. A secret treasure? Uncharted territory? Uncontacted indigenous people? Ginsberg was sold, hook, line, and sinker. Begging Ruprechter to allow him and Stamm to join his expedition, Ruprechter quickly agreed. The two could not have known that Ruprechter was not, in fact, a geologist, but rather a wanted criminal and con man fleeing from the Austrian authorities. The group made the acquaintance of an American, Kevin Gale, who was traveling through South America on a quest to document the people and animals. An avid photographer, it didn't take much convincing for Ruprechter to talk Gale into joining them. Once more, the promise of grand adventure and sights no white man had seen before proved too powerful a lure to resist. The four traveled to the Tuichi River and then followed the river until arriving at a tribal village at the very edge of the known Amazon. There, they stocked up on supplies and spoke to the locals about their trip. The villagers were quick to dissuade the foursome from pushing further into the jungle, citing the many dangers, including the Taramonas people themselves. Nothing would stop the group's quest for riches and adventure though, and the four plunged forth into the thick Amazon jungle. It would be a trip they would quickly regret. The towering trees quickly grow so thickly together that they block out enough sun to leave the jungle below in a state of perpetual twilight. Vines and undergrowth choke the group's progress, forcing them to hack their way forward with machetes. Thick clouds of insects and poisonous snakes dog their every step. The treacherous jungle was seriously slowing their progress, and the supplies they brought with them began to run dangerously low. Within days, they run out completely. The group resorts to eating whatever they can forage. In the heart of the Amazon, however, there's surprisingly little readily available food, unless you have the skill and knowledge to find it. The four don't, but they do get lucky and encounter monkeys occasionally. Ruprechter decides they'll eat meat that day and raises his shotgun to his shoulder, drawing a bead on a monkey. Stamm objects, not wishing to kill any animals unless they absolutely have to. The group quickly turns on him. This is what they must do for survival. Undaunted, Ruprechter once more raises the shotgun and squeezes the trigger. The monkey falls, fatally injured and bleeding profusely. Stamm rushes to the monkey and, to the shock of everyone, pulls out his first aid kit in an attempt to save the monkey's life. Ruprechter violently shoves him aside, scolding him for wasting their medical supplies on a dinner. He then takes the monkey and throws it on Ginsberg's back, tying the hands around his neck. The group pushes forward, moving until nightfall, as Ginsberg's shirt becomes covered in the monkey's blood. At camp that night, Ruprechter lights a fire and roasts the monkey, burning off the fur. Next is the meat, which he cuts up into equal parts so the group can share. Stamm, however, refuses to eat the monkey, and the group turns on him, calling him weak and useless. Eventually, Stamm accepts the meat and tries to eat it, but ends up vomiting it back up. Later, Ginsberg would come to regret the treatment of Stamm. The Swiss man was one of the most kind-hearted he had ever met. While traveling together, they boarded a bus and watched as a thief stole the expensive camera a bird-watching tourist was carrying. The tourist, having come all the way to South America to photograph the continent's exotic birds, broke down into tears. Stamm approached the stranger and offered him his own camera, free of charge, so that he might complete his journey. Stamm should have never come, Ginsberg thinks. The group begins to alienate Stamm as they push further and further into the jungle. Though he would later regret his treatment of him, now Ginsberg begins to greatly resent the soft-hearted Swiss man, and the resentment spreads among Ruprechter and Gale. As the four push deeper and deeper into the jungle, Stamm grows weaker, refusing to eat the monkeys that the other three occasionally hunt and kill. By now, though, the group is starting to have serious suspicions about Ruprechter. As they travel, they ask Ruprechter about his life, training, and the location of the gold that they're seeking. Ruprechter's stories begin to contradict each other, and the three suspicions grow by the day. With mistrust growing within the foursome and resentment towards both Ruprechter and Stamm, the group stops to take stock of their situation. Their supplies are almost completely out. They've been largely subsiding on the occasional fruits and other things they can hunt or scavenge. Stamm has been injured and is physically lagging behind the group on their daily pushes into the jungle. They decide it's best to turn around and head back to the village they departed from. It would be a long, difficult journey, but better than continuing with nearly no supplies and an injured Stamm. Once back in the village, the group recuperates their strength and restocks their provisions. Seeking to salvage the expedition, Ruprechter pitches the group on a new plan. Instead of trudging through the thick jungle again, they could simply ride rafts down the river to a small gold quarry that Ruprechter knew about. From there, they could once more simply raft down to Rurrenabaque, a small town where they could get transportation back to La Paz. The idea of rafting instead of walking into the Amazon is very appealing to the group. Ruprechter told them he was a river guide and Gale was an expert rafter, so their confidence was high. With the help of the villagers, they build their raft and push off, floating once more into the heart of the Green Inferno. Soon, the group arrived at the confluence of two rivers, and Ruprechter suddenly called for them to pull the raft over to the shore. He warned the group of the San Pedro Canyon, a series of very dangerous rapids, boulders, and waterfalls that would be extremely hazardous to try and cross by raft. Also, he told the group that he couldn't swim and refused to continue down the river. They had to continue on foot, he said. The group now was furious with Ruprechter. His contradictory stories and his new betrayal was too much for the group to bear. Also, as the group continued deeper and deeper into the jungle on their raft, Ruprechter had grown increasingly more authoritarian, taking leadership of the group. This was too much, and the group decided to officially split. Gale and Ginsberg decided that they would take their chances on the river, confident of Gale's rafting expertise allowing them to navigate the treacherous waters ahead. It would also make their journey to Rurrenabaque much quicker than to try to continue on foot. Ruprechter, furious at the expedition's cancellation, decided he would simply hike back upriver and return to civilization. It was best, in everyone's opinion, that Stamm go with him. And with a tearful hug, the Swiss man bid Gale and Ginsberg goodbye. The group vowed to meet again just before Christmas in La Paz. Stamm and Ruprechter, however, would never be seen again, even after an extensive search and rescue effort. Whether they were killed by jungle animals or hostile natives or simply succumbed to disease and infection, nobody knows. To this day, nobody also knows what Ruprechter's real objectives were and why he lied to the group about the dangerous rapids and his inability to swim. Clearly, Ruprechter had an alternative goal in mind, and one he hoped to rope the other three into once they were in a position to no longer refuse. What the wanted conman's goals may have been will forever remain a mystery. Gale and Ginsberg quickly meet with the dangerous rapids that they've been warned about. Gale expertly leads the two over the turbulent waters, but then, suddenly their raft smashes into a large boulder, throwing Gale off and plunging him into the tempestuous waters. Ginsberg frantically screams for his friend, but soon he has his own problems, as the raft is pushed over the boulder and violently ripped downstream. Clinging on for dear life, Ginsberg stays with the raft as it suddenly plunges out over a waterfall. The raft smashes into pieces on the rocks below, but miraculously Ginsberg has avoided those same rocks and plunged into a deep pool. He's lost everything though, his supplies, camping gear, and even his compass. Desperate to find Gale, he tries to climb the cliff back upriver, spending the entire night doing so. The effort, however, is futile, and Ginsberg is forced to turn back. Now his only hope is to follow the river and continue with the original plan to reach civilization. This time, however, he'll have to do it through the thick Amazon jungle, and he'll have to do it with only the shirt on his back. Ginsberg has to travel over 100 miles to reach safety, and every inch of it through jungle infested with jaguars, wild boars, snakes, and venomous insects. With no camping gear, Ginsberg has to find what comfort he can on the jungle floor, which is crawling with giant cockroaches and other insects with painful bites and stings. Sleep rarely comes for more than a few minutes at a time, and when the sun rises, the temperature soars to nearly 100 degrees. In the thick, humid jungle, breathing feels almost like drowning, and Ginsberg is essentially traveling through a sauna. The constant humidity and heat wreaks havoc on Ginsberg's body. Fungus and other infections quickly take hold. Every scratch, cut, and scrape is quick to become infected. Open blisters form on his battered feet as he struggles to push through the thick jungle and closer to civilization. The blisters leak pus, and at night the worms feed on him. Ginsberg has lost 30 pounds in 2 weeks. He's covered in insect bites and delirious from lack of food. However, Ginsberg is not alone. A young native woman has been his traveling companion for days now. She's unaffected by the tortures of the thick jungle and doesn't speak any English. Like him, she appears to be lost, and even though she never says a word to him, Ginsberg feels that he must protect her and ensure she gets to safety. This feeds his resolve, keeping him from giving up even as his body is failing him and beginning to break down. If he can't save himself, then he must save the young girl. On day 17 of being lost in the jungle, Ginsberg suddenly hears the sound of an airplane. He crashes through the jungle, desperately searching for an opening in the canopy, somewhere that he can signal for help. Finding an open spot near the river, Ginsberg begins to jump up and down and wave his arms, screaming until his voice completely fails him. The plane doesn't spot him, however, and quickly disappears into a cloud bank. The crushing disappointment nearly snuffs out that last bit of will to live in Ginsberg, but then he thinks of his companion. The mute native girl is still there by his side, and she, like him, still needs rescuing. If he gives up, neither of them will make it out alive. Ginsberg plunges back into the jungle. He wills his battered and beaten body to continue forward. At one point, he fends off a curious jaguar, lured by the smell of Ginsberg's rotting flesh. The cat backs off, but Ginsberg can hear it occasionally in the nearby jungle. The cat knows the same thing Ginsberg does. Death is near. All the jaguar has to do is wait. On the 19th day, Ginsberg can no longer stand on his feet. He hasn't eaten anything substantial in over 2 weeks. Despite the overwhelming abundance of life around him, the jungle is incredibly barren unless you know exactly where to look, and Ginsberg lacks the training. He's ready to give up, but then he spots a massive colony of fire ants on a nearby tree. He knows his body needs a jolt of energy, something to get him back on his feet again, even if it's for the last time. He needs to push himself just a little bit further in hopes of rescue. His mute traveling companion is depending on him. He moves up to the tree and begins to shake it, causing the fire ants to rain down on him from above. The furious insects immediately attack Ginsberg's flesh, delivering dozens of painful stings. Waves of pain course over Ginsberg's body, but the pain also releases steroids into his bloodstream, giving his body a desperately needed jolt of energy. Ginsberg pushes back into the jungle once more, breaking through the thick cover and finally spotting a small opening by the river. This is it. He can't take one more step, and he collapses. Tears in his eyes, he apologizes to his mute traveling companion, the native girl watching him with kind eyes. While his own body is covered in pus-oozing sores and infected wounds, she is still completely untouched by the horrors of their ordeal. Ginsberg closes his eyes, blacking out. An entire day passes with Ginsberg on that riverbank, when he's suddenly awakened by the sound of a motorboat and shouting. Blinking against the brutal sun, Ginsberg barely has the strength to crane his neck and look in the direction of the sound. To his amazement, he spots a canoe, and most incredible of all, Gale is at the bow, frantically encouraging the natives he's riding with to move the boat faster. Ginsberg would go on to be saved by Gale, who after getting thrown off the raft was swept to the riverbank. There he stayed, looking for Ginsberg before being rescued by 2 native hunters. Once back in the village, he organized the rest of the villagers to launch a search and rescue effort, lasting almost 3 weeks. Incredibly, the group would find Ginsberg and bring him back to civilization, where he'd spend 3 months in recovery. As far as Ginsberg's companion, the mute indigenous woman he traveled with, there would be no evidence of her ever discovered. Ginsberg himself, however, refutes that she was merely a hallucination brought on by starvation, illness, and stress. Who or what she may have been still remains a mystery. It's the perfect day to spend at an amusement park. The sun is shining, your whole day is wide open, which means you and your 3 friends can spend a whole day riding the rides. You've eaten some cotton candy, taken a spin on the tilt-a-whirl, and now you're ready to brave the park's top attraction, Dragon's Peak. The fearsome roller coaster sends you down the steepest drop in the park and then sends you upside down as you speed around a massive loop. As you and your friends enter the line, you notice how perfectly themed the waiting area is. There's a suit of armor, an old witch, and other details that make you feel like you're standing in the middle of a medieval fantasy. And as you and your friends approach the ride, you notice one more cool detail. Hey look, they've got a goblin operating the ride. The short, stubby-looking man with long ears and big teeth operating the ride looks up suddenly. What'd you say? That's a great goblin outfit, man. Super realistic makeup. I'm not wearing any makeup. This is my face. Think I look like a goblin? I mean, I thought this was a fantasy ride. I get my looks from my mother's side of my family. You try to apologize as you're ushered into the final queue area to wait for the next ride. Your friends are seated in the next car in, but there's no room for you, so you'll take the next one. It rides up and you get into your favorite seat right in the front. You think it's a little odd that you're the only one seated in this car. There are a lot of people on the line, but you don't think too much about it as the not-a-goblin ride attendant presses down on your lap bar, securing you in the seat. He smirks at you as he presses the button, and you're off. The ride is as exciting as you heard. You're sent shooting up a hill, down a massive drop, and into the first loop. You sail into the incline, turn upside down, and stop. It takes you a second to realize this isn't part of the ride, but your car isn't moving, and you're hanging upside down over 100 feet above the park. What are you gonna do? Your first thought is to wave your arms and call for help. But you're so far away from anyone that It's unlikely anyone could hear you. You're looking back at the track for other cars, but none seem to be coming. At least you don't have to worry about anyone crashing into you. Your next thought is to reach for your cell phone and try to call for help. You struggle to reach into your pocket, but the roller coaster seat harness is tight and presses down on your lap and shoulder. You are grateful for that because it's going to keep you from slipping out of your harness while hanging upside down. But it's going to make it very difficult to pull your phone out of your pocket. And even if you got it out, you're worried about dropping it more than 100 feet above the ground. Not only would that be the end of your phone, but it could be dangerous for anyone on the ground. Besides, you're pretty sure everyone can see you hanging here. The good news is you have a watch on your wrist, so you can keep track of the time. It feels like you've been hanging upside down for half an hour already, and it's been 3 minutes. At least you can keep a sense of time. You thought your grandpa was silly when he gave you that watch. You can't trust that modern technology. A good old wristwatch is reliable and will help you out when you can't pull out your phone. I guess grandpa knew what he was talking about. But right now your priority is keeping sane and healthy while waiting for rescue. You used to do handstands as a little kid, so you know all about how quickly you get dizzy when hanging upside down. The second you flip upside down, your blood starts to rush to your head, and that wreaks all sort of havoc inside your body, starting with the shift of weight from all around your body to your upper body organs. Your organs start to put extra weight on your lungs, making it harder to breathe easily. Your heart has to do more work because more blood is flowing toward it, and you can already start to feel it racing. And that's not even starting on what happens to your head and your brain. As the pressure builds in your head, you start to feel more pressure in your eyes, which can cause double vision and headaches. Of course, this only happens if you've been hanging upside down for a few hours or more. This isn't the first time you've been stuck on a ride, and you're sure the amusement park's technical team is going to be on the case. You remember when you were a kid and the boat got stuck in the storybook canyon ride with your parents. They told you to keep your hands inside the vehicle, stay calm, and listen to the instructions from the intercom. It seemed like it was forever, but eventually the boat started moving again. Turns out a guy had fallen in the canal while getting off, and security had to fish him out. That was a lot less scary than this. But the rules are the same. You know that the most dangerous thing you can do right now is try to mess with the harness or do anything to interfere with the ride. As long as you're locked into your seat, you're not in any danger, as long as this is resolved quickly enough. Your mind is racing, and you try to recall how other situations like this have ended. You read a few articles about amusement park disasters a while back. Maybe you should have remembered them before deciding to come here. Most roller coaster stops happen on flat surfaces, such as ascents or descents. They're usually caused by power failures, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. You can see other rides functioning fine in the park below. Sometimes a safety feature gets triggered accidentally, causing an emergency stop at the most uncomfortable place. That's probably what happened here, unless the not a goblin did it deliberately. You know you can't let the blood pool in your head too much, so you decide to keep moving. You lift your head as much as you can, tilt it from side to side, trying to keep the blood flowing. It's only been about 10 minutes and you're already starting to feel dizzy with a bad headache coming on. When other roller coaster riders were stuck upside down for over half an hour, like on the X coaster at Magic Springs and Crystal Falls, several people went to the hospital to be checked out. In the worst incident like this in the United States, at Six Flags America in Gurnee, Illinois, a group of people were stranded upside down on the Demon for over 2 hours. Not only did 4 people wind up hospitalized, but the park wound up paying $442,000 after a jury ruled against them. Well, if they don't get you down from here soon, at least you might wind up rich. You're starting to feel nauseous, and you're worried you're going to spray all that cotton candy and funnel cake all over the park below. Fortunately, you hear a humming sound and you can see a large crane with someone in the basket starting to rise up toward you. A man in a hard hat pulls out a megaphone. "Are you okay up there? I'm starting to get dizzy. I think I'm going to pass out if I hang here much longer. Hold on, we're going to get you out of there." The medical team needs to hurry. It's common for people who are stuck hanging upside down for too long to need to be hospitalized, and a man who was upside down for over 24 hours while trapped in a cave even died of asphyxiation due to the pressure on his lungs. A similar fate befell a hiker whose foot got stuck while rappelling into a canyon. He was left hanging for an entire night when he couldn't free himself, and by the time rescuers were able to get to him, it was too late. There's plenty of other health risks from hanging upside down too. Our blood vessels are designed to work against gravity and keep our blood from pooling in our feet. When you're hanging upside down, the body doesn't know how to reverse that process and keep blood from pooling in the brain instead. While a lack of blood flow to the brain is really bad news, too much is equally dangerous and can lead to a brain hemorrhage, which is bleeding in or around the brain. It's rough on your other organs too. The heart has to work overtime trying to pump your blood in a direction it's not used to, and can have trouble getting enough blood to different organs, and you can even experience heart failure from it working overtime. You can see the man in the crane go back down and start to confer with people on the ground. You know that past solutions for people stuck upside down on roller coasters have involved using ropes to pull the cart back to the starting gate, like was done in China in 2011. But you can't imagine that working given how wild this ride was. More often, they'll crank the car back to the starting position and rescue you from there once you're closer to the ground. If they can't figure out any of those options, they'll strap you into a retractable harness and then cut away the restraining bar before lowering you to the ground. That takes a lot of manpower and is a tricky operation, so you hope they won't have to do that. As it turns out, they don't. A technician is raised up to the car and looks at the mechanism holding you in place. It doesn't take long for him to radio back to the team on the ground. It's the emergency brake. It got triggered when he was at the top of the hill. If you release it in the control console, it should get him moving again. There's a slow whirring noise in the car, and as quickly as you stopped, it's over. The car, which has some ropes attached to it to keep it oriented correctly, slides out of the loop and onto a controlled stop at the base of the track before slowly being towed to the end of the ride. The harness is manually released and you're lifted out of the car by the medical team on site. It's a good thing, too. You were only upside down for about 20 minutes, but you are extremely dizzy and your legs feel like jelly. The rush of your body reorienting itself and your blood going back to where it should be makes you feel like you're about to pass out. The medical team checks you out. Fortunately, you weren't hanging upside down long enough to cause any serious damage. They tell you to take it easy though. No more crazy rides for the rest of the day. That won't be a problem. You're definitely not in the mood for any more roller coasters right now. Your friends are waiting for you as soon as the medical team gets done, and you can see the not-a-goblin being escorted away by security and placed in handcuffs. Your friends tell you he sabotaged the ride to leave you trapped, and the park is definitely going to press charges if you testify. You're met by the park manager, who apologizes profusely and offers you a free annual pass as an apology for your experience. You don't know when you'll want to go on a roller coaster again, but you're glad to be off of that one. The nausea is passing quickly now that you're upright, and you think the perfect way to end the day is another funnel cake. Your ride on Dragon's Peak was harrowing, but it could have been worse. Now go watch the worst amusement park disasters for just how bad it can really get. Or check out I Was Trapped Underwater for 3 days for an escape from a much tighter spot than a roller coaster loop. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.